Yes, and hello, and thanks for joining us this afternoon on Broadcasting Scotland. And today we're going to be live streaming from the Scottish National Party's online conference. The SNP has been meeting today and yesterday in an online session for their afternoon conference. Now, shortly we're going to go live to hear the speech by the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney. Now, he's scheduled to begin his talk at 2 o'clock. So we'll go live to that. John Swinney is expected to say that we're now at a crunch time for the Scottish Parliament itself. He's going to say, I believe, that the Scottish Parliament is actually under threat from the Internal Market Bill post-Brexit. So we'll hear how the Deputy First Minister argues that shortly. So following the Deputy First Minister's remarks, there will be more motions debated and discussed. So while we're waiting for John Swinney, I thought we should go over some of the conference decisions which have been made already. Now, in yesterday's conference, it was agreed that financial equality for women is a topic that should be put in a human rights framework. The conference heard that, for example, that there's a 40% pensions gap between males and females, and also that 23% of women pensioners live in poverty. So that proposal to regard this as a human rights issue was adopted by a conference. Yesterday, the conference debated Scotland's prison population. With 133 prisoners per 100,000 of the population, Scotland has more people in jail than most European countries, although the numbers are not too out of line with the rest of the UK. However, compared to 133 per 100,000, in France you have 90 and fewer in some other countries like Netherlands. Conference suggested that the best way to look at this is to search for alternatives to locking people up, and the Finnish model was quoted as an alternative worth looking at. So the Finnish model is all about rehabilitation and finding alternatives to locking people up. So that was agreed. Next to conference, as we reported yesterday, conference discussed tightening and maintaining Scotland's links with the European Parliament. Now, it's not commonly known that Scotland actually has 3 MEPs. Or to be more specific, the 3 people from the SNP who were elected just before Scotland was booted out of the European Union, they still have observer status because our 3 MEPs are actually members of the European political party, the EFA. Now, as members of the EFA, we are still part of that organisation, and then when Scotland was taken out of the EU, although we'd voted to stay in it, the EFA extended observer status to our 3 former MEPs. So conference noted that we do still have an official engagement with the European Parliament. Speakers yesterday, including Christian Allard, who's a French-Scottish national and a former MEP, speakers like Christian argued that Scotland has had a very large role to play in the European Parliament, and the fact that Winnie Ewing, our first MEP, was in fact one of the people who started the Erasmus student exchange system. So conference agreed that it's excellent that we should keep these links going, and we look forward to Scotland again rejoining the EU as an independent country. Okay, excuse me. Other discussions yesterday included the Emily Pink test. This is the card which young women students are invited to take, which has emergency contact numbers should anyone report male violence. And it was agreed that the 100,000 cards which have already been distributed to colleges and universities should be extended throughout Scotland. The Emily Pink test card has vital phone numbers, not only useful for people making a disclosure, but also for people whom they come into contact with, people in university or members of the services whom they speak to. The card will tell them instantly where are the helplines you can get in touch with. So conference agreed to the further rollout of the Emily Pink test cards. Conference also heard yesterday about the issue of glyphosate pollution. Now, glyphosate is an element which is included in many pesticides. For years, there's been controversy about how dangerous glyphosate is, not just to the natural habitat, because obviously it's aimed it's aimed at killing things, and it does that successfully. But there's also severe fears about its risk to human health. But what is also known is it does, in fact, impact on the bee population and on other insects, worms, for example. So speakers yesterday suggested that glyphosate is clearly something which should have a warning attached. And the conference agreed to set up a working party to look in neutrally to whether glyphosate on the whole is doing more harm than good. And if it turns out that it is dangerous, it should be put on the banned list. So that was again agreed yesterday. Yesterday, the conference began with an opening address by Keith Brown, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice. Mr. Brown suggested that, on the one hand, the Westminster system has now clearly been broken beyond repair, as we've seen from many controversies, including this week. And he once again said, surely it's better for Scotland to make its own decisions right here instead of having them handed over to Westminster. So that was the opening remarks. And as I said, we will hear further remarks today from the Deputy First Minister. And Ian Blackford is going to speak tomorrow. And I believe the First Minister is going to speak on Monday. So you'll be able to get the highlights of the First Minister's talk on the Scottish News at 7 o'clock on Monday night. Okay, so that's a quick summary of what the conference decided yesterday. And now today, so far, in the morning session, the conference discussed the problem of rural post offices and banks. Conference noted that in many rural and island communities, when the last post office or the last bank closes, that really contributes to the erosion of the island community and further speeds up the depopulation. Now, what conference suggested is that to replace the departing banks and post offices, that we should set up new hubs, new community hubs, which would include the services that you used to get from the post office and also the banking services. It's also proposed that the departing commercial banks ought to pay for some of that. So the idea is to have these new hubs set up in island and rural communities as a centre and a focus for life, and to try and a focus for community life, and to try to stop the further loss of population in rural and island communities. So that was agreed. Conference also this morning discussed street harassment against women and girls. Conference urged the Criminal Justice Scotland Working Group to include misogyny and call-outs, street calling out on women and girls. It suggested this working group, which is a part of the Scottish Government, should also include kind of street misogyny, if you like, in its remit, and report back on that. So again, that was agreed. Next, the conference discussed British Sign Language and how much of British Sign Language, BSL, is available for students in colleges, schools and universities. Conference noted that we don't actually have enough BSL trained interpreters. The approach conference took from this motion was that BSL should be regarded as a language, and as students are learning French or German or Spanish or other languages, BSL ought to be regarded on a par with those. Conference also agreed that being a tutor, being an interpreter for British Sign Language ought to be regarded as a career path, and that more young people, more students should be encouraged to take up BSL interpreting as a career. Okay, now today we also discussed the conference also discussed, we didn't, but we weren't online at the time, but we have heard that Scotland has 7,500 civil servants working for the Scottish Government. In addition, the UK civil service working in places. That's coming up later. This is coming up later on. And what they will discuss is the numbers of UK civil servants located in Scotland is about 25,000. And the equivalent numbers for other European countries would number something like 40,000. So what it boils down to is that the conference will discuss this morning that if moving to independence, Scotland appears to be about 10,000 short, and so there will need to be a recruitment of more Scottish civil servants. So that's going to come up later on. Now, we also had this morning emergency motions brought forward First of all, I'm going to just point out the one on carbon capture and storage. Now, as we have reported earlier on Scotland at 7, the UK government for several years had supported, apparently, the large carbon capture scheme off St Fergus in Aberdeenshire, and the scheme was to use old oil and gas facilities and use that for keeping carbon and for also possibly generating hydrogen. So this was a major scheme which the UK government over many years had suggested that they were backing with the enthusiastic support of the Scottish government. Now this, of course, is a major part of the jobs transition scheme. It was a major part of the Scottish Government's idea that people can be retrained and gradually moved out of oil and gas carbon jobs into low carbon jobs. Now, this morning the conference heard an emergency resolution about the UK Government cancelling that carbon capture project at St Fergus. So conference has called on the UK Government to do a U-turn on its decision not to invest in carbon capture at St Fergus. Party members passed a resolution calling the UK Government's failure to support the Scottish cluster of proposed carbon capture, utilisation and storage projects as an illustration of its lack of ambition and commitment to communities in the northeast of Scotland who are so dependent on this energy transition. The projects in the Scottish cluster could support an average of 15,100 jobs between next year and 2050, reaching a peak of maybe 20,600 jobs by 2031. SNP politicians and businesses across the region have been calling for the Tory UK government to change its widely criticised decision, which the SNP says compromises Scotland's ability to take crucial near-term action to reduce emissions. Commenting, the SNP's MSP Gillian Martin said, "Since 2015, the Conservatives have cut $1 billion in funding for a carbon capture scheme at Peterhead and failed to match the Scottish Government's $500 million investment in the just transition." Right, so that was the emergency motion on carbon capture, calling on the UK Government to U-turn. There was also an emergency motion on asylum seekers following the tragic events this week when 27 were drowned in the English Channel between France and the English coast. Commenting, Stuart MacDonald, MP, said, "The SNP members have today made the simple but vital point that people seeking asylum and crossing the Channel are human beings whom we have the moral and legal duty to treat with dignity and compassion. We must never forget that. Tory ministers have spent years ignoring warnings over the damaging hostile environment policy. This tragic event reported earlier this week should be a wake-up call to the UK government to provide safe and legal routes to the UK for asylum seekers." He went on to say, "The UK government has some of the most restrictive family reunion ties in Europe. Rules in Europe. The Tory anti-refugee bill will further restrict reunion rights, putting more people in a position where they feel they have no choice but to make the dangerous journey across the Channel to be with loved ones." Okay, we're shortly going to go live to this afternoon's conference, which is scheduled to begin at 2 p.m. Now, in our coverage this afternoon, we're going to be looking live at conference and we're going to be listening to some of the speeches and we'll give some commentary. And if we can get hold of people, because I know everyone's busy, we'll try to get some actual conversations with members of the conference as the debates take place. So we're shortly going to go over to John Swinney, who's scheduled to talk from about 2 o'clock to about 2:15. Okay, so after Mr. Swinney's finished, there will be motions on, as I said, the size of the Scottish civil service. There's also going to be proposals on increasing rail links for Dumfries and Galloway. There's also going to be discussion on the just transition and on what kind of skills are needed and how we're going to concretely organise for the retraining, moving people out of oil and gas and into low carbon. Okay, so the SNP conference will be streaming shortly. So you get that live on Broadcasting Scotland. So I'm just waiting to hear from when the Deputy First Minister is about to start. Okay. Okay, so they are going to discuss the roadmap to sorting out what kind of skills are needed for the just transition. And yeah, that's all right. After that, there is also going to be a discussion on estranged students. This is the situation of students who have, for one reason or another, no family support, and what kind of support they can receive from the colleges. Particularly estranged students may find that they're not able to get a guarantor for rent. Most universities don't have anything in place for that. Okay, so we're shortly going over live to the SNP Conference. It's just coming up. As you can see, the countdown has started. And so as soon as we get live, we should be hearing from the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney. He should be coming up shortly.
Welcome back, delegates. We have a great afternoon at Annual National Conference to look forward to, and we have a really fantastic start to it with a speech from Deputy First Minister John Swinney, MSP. So welcome, John.
Friends, it's a great privilege to once again address you, albeit in the comfort of your own homes. I'm very much looking forward to being back in a hall with all of you at our next conference. But I'm also thankful that we live in a world where technology has allowed us all to stay in touch with each other, even during a global pandemic. We gather for our annual conference in a rapidly changing world. And to adapt a well-known phrase, the last few weeks have certainly been a very, very long time in politics. Since we last met, the eyes of the world have been on Scotland as Glasgow hosted the COP26 Climate Summit. This may go down as the most important gathering of world leaders this century. It was a huge privilege to host this event, but also a huge responsibility. We are indebted to the thousands of people involved in organising the event who worked tirelessly to keep the tens of thousands of visitors safe during a global pandemic. And the people of Glasgow were welcoming hosts. They once again proved that the magnificent city of Glasgow is a world-class city with world-class leadership. Although we were not meant to be at the top table of those negotiations, the SNP government did everything we could to positively influence the talks. And delegates, Scotland may not yet be a member of the United Nations in our own right, but our First Minister has demonstrated that when that day comes, Scotland can and will have a powerful and positive role to play on the world stage. Tackling the climate emergency is not going to be easy, but we have no choice. We need to act now for the sake of our children and our grandchildren. But I know that we can do this. We can all pull together and play our part. We all know what it is like to have our resolve tested to the limit, because we've been living through a global pandemic. COVID-19 has taken many, many lives. It has upended our society and thrown up unprecedented challenges in our economy and society. People have seen their financial security taken away, their education disrupted, or their job prospects diminished. The pandemic has made us all think hard about what really matters the most. And it has also been a painful reminder of how unequal our society is. We all know the impacts of this pandemic have not been felt evenly. This is true in Scotland as much as it is in any other country. We have done everything we could to support people during the worst of the pandemic, from introducing free school meals during the school holidays, significant payments to low-income families with school children, as well as a one-off payment of £130 to around 500,000 people, and major boosts to the Scottish Welfare Fund and discretionary housing payments. But despite our best efforts, those who were already the most disadvantaged in our communities have also suffered disproportionately during the pandemic. We have a moral duty, using all of the limited powers that the Scottish Parliament currently has, to do everything we can to ensure that the people who have lost the most during the pandemic are now supported the most after the pandemic. And going forward, that is exactly what the SNP government intends to do. We've recently published a detailed COVID recovery strategy which places fairness front and centre of our plans. We've worked extensively across civic society in Scotland to devise these plans with organisations like the Citizens' Assembly, the Social Renewal Advisory Board and many more. Just as we have learned a lot about ourselves during the pandemic, we have seen what can be achieved in government when we look past traditional barriers. When we can strain every sinew to get the right service or support to people exactly when they need it. And just as confronting the pandemic head-on was a collective endeavour, our recovery must be a genuine Team Scotland effort, not just of national government, but also local government, the third sector and businesses large and small. We're not interested in rebuilding the world as it was in 2019. We are building Scotland for future generations, and we must do so with ambition and with resolve. I know that if we can capture the same energy, imagination and urgency that we've seen in the last couple of years, we will deliver a springboard to a fairer, greener Scotland for future generations. Conference, the lesson we should all learn from our First Minister's outstanding leadership over the last couple of years is that if you take decisions honestly and openly, then the people of Scotland will trust you and they will support you. We will always strive to show respect to the people who have elected us. Meanwhile, the Tory government at Westminster show them little but contempt. Contempt for Scottish democratic wishes, contempt for Scotland's democratic parliament, and led by a Prime Minister who seems to have contempt for everyone who isn't called Boris Johnson. A Prime Minister who seems to have spent almost as much time recently at Peppa Pig World as he did at COP26. But you know, if it's snouts in the trough that Boris Johnson wants to see, he doesn't need to go all the way to Peppa Pig World. He just needs to look along the Commons benches to those sitting around him. What has been revealed about the behaviour of Tory MPs in recent weeks has been going on for years, and the charge sheet is long and shameful. The Tories have rewritten the definitions of cronyism and corruption, and when they are caught bang to rights by an independent investigation, they just rewrite the rulebook as well. While the world's eyes were on Glasgow, looking for leadership on the climate emergency, what they saw instead was a Prime Minister repeatedly forced to deny that the UK is a corrupt country. Conference, let's not kid ourselves. Westminster is rotten to the core. The Tories have no democratic mandate to govern Scotland, and they have lost all moral authority to hold the highest offices in the land. The people of Scotland deserve so much better than the Tories. Delegates, the never-ending circus of the Tory government would be almost funny if it were not so serious. But there is one issue on which they are working, almost under the radar, with a very clear political objective. While the SNP government has been using every power at our disposal over the last couple of years to tackle the pandemic, the Tories have been quietly working to undermine devolution. This goes completely against what the people of Scotland voted for in 1997. I'm immensely proud of the achievements of devolution. All of us should be. The Scottish Parliament helped revitalise Scottish democracy and civic engagement. It has enabled us to make different and better policy choices from Westminster. And even with its limited powers, devolution has helped us to mitigate some of the very worst Tory policies, such as the bedroom tax. Very few people in Scotland would now want to roll back the clock to the way things were before. But we are now seeing a concerted attack on our Parliament from the very people who fought tooth and nail against it being established in the first place. In a grotesque irony, the Tories are using something that the people of Scotland voted overwhelmingly against, Brexit, to undermine something they voted overwhelmingly for, the Scottish Parliament. There have been many threats to Scotland's social and economic well-being as a result of Brexit, and many of them are only just beginning to be felt. Take the new Internal Market Act, which was the Tories' smoke and mirror replacement of the European single market. It certainly has an innocuous sounding name, and I'm pretty sure that was intentional. But nothing could be further from the truth. Through this act, the Tories have given themselves unfettered power to decide the rules of the internal market and to completely ignore the devolution settlement if they want to. This is not some abstract constitutional debate. The Act gives them powers to spend public funds in devolved areas like education, culture and sport, all to fit their own priorities and giving us no say. It means they can ride roughshod over the ban on some single-use plastics that we recently announced as part of Scotland's effort to tackle the climate emergency. Does anyone seriously think that an innovation like minimum unit pricing for alcohol, which, let's remind ourselves, after hearing all the evidence and argument, the courts held to be compatible with EU law, would have been possible if this insidious act had been in place at that time? If all of this seems far-fetched to you, just remember that this is the UK government which took us to court to have parts of the legislation to ensure the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child was embedded in Scots law struck down. This was a bill passed unanimously by the Scottish Parliament, trying to enact a policy which the UK themselves made in 1991 but haven't fulfilled. It didn't matter that the bill would have enormously benefited children's rights. What Westminster couldn't handle was any suggestion that Scotland could be getting too big for its boots. Even the noble cause of advancing child welfare should not be allowed to get in the way of Westminster control, according to the Tories. Friends, self-government has been an immense success story for Scotland, as we always knew it would be. For my entire adult life, I have been committed to empowering the people of Scotland to have an ever greater say in how their country is run. When I joined the SNP as a teenager, the people of Scotland had recently voted for a Scottish Assembly, but they had seen their democratic wishes denied by a tawdry coalition of Tory and Labour unionists who decided that they knew better than the people of Scotland what was best. Some things never change, I guess. But those who believed in Scottish self-government never gave up. I was proud to campaign in the devolution referendum in 1997. I was privileged to be able to vote as an MP for the legislation that established the Scottish Parliament after almost 300 years. And in the wake of the independence referendum, I represented the SNP on the cross-party Smith Commission, which took our Parliament on the next steps with greater tax and social security powers. The direction of travel was clear. More decisions being taken in Scotland led to better decisions being taken for Scotland. And despite the boasts from Labour that devolution would kill nationalism stone dead, it has in fact proved conclusively that the people of Scotland are more than capable of governing ourselves. So it's no wonder that the Westminster control freaks are so determined to undermine it. In public, the Tories say they are committed to making devolution work, but behind the scenes, they are plotting to make it unworkable. There'll be no sudden Big Bang moment. Boris Johnson is not going to stand up and announce to the cheering Tory faithful that he is dismantling the devolution settlement, much as I'm sure he would like to. But make no mistake, piece by piece, devolution is quietly being filleted, hollowed out from the inside by a Tory party which has always opposed the idea of anything other than unfettered Westminster control on Scotland. Much like the climate emergency, which is slowly creeping up on us every single day, we need to issue a code red for devolution. All of us who care so deeply about the Scottish Parliament and its role in Scottish public life need to stand up and be counted before it is too late. Sadly though, it looks like we can't count on Labour and the Liberal Democrats to be part of this fight. Just last week in the Scottish Parliament, they voted with the Tories to endorse the disgraceful attack on the devolution funding settlement. Never in my life would I have imagined that those parties who campaigned for the Scottish Parliament would now be shrugging their shoulders as the Tories undermine it. The truth is that they care more about preserving the Union than preserving the Scottish Parliament. They tolerated devolution while they were in charge, but as soon as they lost power, they gave up on it. Well, the SNP will certainly not give up. We will fight this Tory power grab for as long as it takes, because to give in on this most pressing of issues would be to give up on the people of Scotland, and that is not what the Scottish National Party is about. But conference, there is a bigger question here that we must consider. If devolution is no longer safe under Westminster control, if everyday decisions taken by our elected Scottish Parliament can be routinely undermined at a whim by the Tories, and if even Labour and the Liberal Democrats are more interested in preserving the Union than protecting devolution, then how can the Scottish Parliament ever be protected as long as we remain under Westminster control? The answer is that it cannot. There is no status quo any longer. The only way to stop Scotland going backwards on the constitutional journey is by moving forwards. The only way to keep the gains of devolution is by becoming independent. You know, the case for independence is stronger than it has ever been. Never has Scotland's extraordinary potential as an independent nation been clearer. And never has Westminster control seemed so damaging to Scotland's interests. For those of you who are impatient for independence, I know how you feel, so am I. But I also take heart from just how far we have come as a movement. House by house, street by street, day by day and year by year, we have made the case for self-government in Scotland. We must continue to demonstrate to people in every corner of this nation that no one can make better decisions about their country's future than the people of this country can. And remind them that despite what they've been told for decades by Westminster, they live in an extraordinarily wealthy country, blessed with enormous natural resources and human talent. The Westminster establishment may think that they can wish away Scotland's independence movement, but they should be absolutely clear that they won't be able to do that. Our movement is growing, and the case for independence grows ever stronger by the day. We are here to stay, and in the end, if we stay the course, we will win.
Thank you very much, John. Delegates, we're now going to move on to the next of our resolutions, which is resolution number 10, entitled the Independent Scotland Civil Service. And that resolution will be proposed by Tim Rideout of Dalkeith Branch and seconded by Seamus Call of Thurso and District Branch. And Seamus is a first-time speaker at conference. So welcome, Tim and Seamus.
Conference. I'm an economist who makes maps, and so I'm interested not just in what happens in the economy, but where it happens. That is, issues such as national development between countries, decentralisation, and regional inequalities within countries. It's no coincidence that successful countries usually have well-diversified regional economies. One of the best examples is Germany, where there is no dominant city. Berlin is only a third the population of London, and civil service jobs and departments are dispersed across the nation. The UK, by contrast, is one of the most centralised countries in the world. That's not just legal control from Westminster, but in terms of economic activity. London acts in many ways as a giant leech. The southeast is overcrowded while houses and factories stand empty further north. The concentration of government departments and the associated well-paid civil service jobs, hundreds of thousands of them, simply reinforces London's dominance. The current 7,500 Scottish Government staff are mostly Edinburgh-based, as are those in Alistair Jack's new Union Jack branded Imperial headquarters. It would be very easy, therefore, for independent Scotland to fall in the same trap as London if we do not recognise the issue and take steps to avoid it. We will not have a happy and successful nation if areas outside the central belt do not share in the benefits of independence. Many areas already have problems of ageing and depopulation, as younger people leave for better opportunities elsewhere. This resolution seeks to ensure that the Scottish Government leads by example. It's a very practical way to demonstrate commitment to a well-being economy. There's no reason for ministries and agencies to all be in Edinburgh or Glasgow, and indeed they should not be. Zoom has taught us all about modern communications. Similar sized countries, Denmark for example, have around 50,000 core civil servants. So we'll be adding thousands more posts as we establish foreign affairs, defence, finance, and right down to my area of interest in our own replacement for the Ordnance Survey. The resolution specifies that the civil service jobs should be fairly distributed across our 32 councils in proportion to their populations. It also recognises that remote, rural and deprived areas can be helped to overcome those issues by an extra allocation of new civil service jobs. And it does propose a minimum 20% uplift for those areas. That would apply to places like Dumfries and Galloway, Inverclyde and Caerphilly and Ellenshire. What does this look like? 1,970 posts for Dumfries, maybe the Ministry of Agriculture, 355 for the Western Isles, perhaps the Coast Guard headquarters, 2,654 for Aberdeenshire and 2,310 for Aberdeen City. Could be the Ministry of Energy and the National Energy Company, 1,510 for Dundee, as well as we add the remaining benefits and pensions functions to Social Security Scotland. And so the list goes on. And it isn't just the civil servant, as there's probably a partner and often a family. We already pay the wages of those extra civil servants, but they're just in London. So it isn't an additional cost. London gets the spending and the tax at the moment, but it sends us the bill. Moving it all to Scotland is an additional benefit because those wages will be spent here and the tax will be collected by Revenue Scotland. I would also add that we need to build a civil service and the functions and ministries that suit us. We do not need things like Ofcom, Ofgem and the rail regulator, for example. Delegates, let us take this important step forward in our preparations for independence.
Thurso and District Branch fully supports this motion and urges Conference to do likewise. For our future national well-being, we need not and should not replicate the UK government practice of locating government ministries almost within walking distance of Westminster, which, as has been said, acts as a giant leech. Edinburgh will be our capital city in an independent Scotland. And just as London sucks the life out of everywhere outside of its boundaries, we could do the same if we don't plan now to do it better. Some ministries will function best in Edinburgh. Finance, Justice, and our Foreign Office spring to mind. All other government ministries, complete with minister and key permanent staff, should, in principle, be located where their presence will bring most economic and cultural benefit to their host town or city. The technology already exists to allow remote working, so no ministry can be considered to be remote from the centre of national government. The procedure developed under the COVID epidemic has proved that. We've seen Ian Blackford contribute to Westminster debates, and MSPs do likewise with Holyrood. We can prevent replicating the built-in conflict between the capital and the regions in the present UK, and also prevent some regional capitals taking more than their fair share of employment resources and opportunities. Take Highland region as one example, a region the same physical size as Belgium. There are several previously prosperous towns in the region which now struggle to retain their populations. Dingwall, Fort William, Portree, Ullapool, Invergordon, Alness, Tain, Golspie, Wick and Thurso. 3,000 jobs spread among them would give them each a huge boost and employ redundant offices. The connection between previously prosperous towns now struggling to stabilise their population and these same towns having had their local government removed to a place remote from them is not lost on Highland citizens. Local authority functions were centralised and decision makers clustered in Inverness. Let's rethink Scotland and reverse that and take government to the people rather than centralising it away from them. Conference, please support this motion.
Thank you, Seamus, and thank you to Tim. Delegates, our next speaker speaking against the resolution is Graham McCormick of Helensburgh Branch. So welcome to Graham.
Afternoon Conference. At first sight, this resolution looks attractive, but most of the infrastructure for departments of state are already in place anyway. Faslane for defence, Glasgow for enterprise, Dundee for social security, Aberdeen for energy, to name but a few. The citing of central government departments in certain places is just good sense, as it's not in anyone's interest if Edinburgh's economy becomes overheated. Much of that depends on how many civil servants we shall actually need. But artificial placement isn't necessary. Indeed, there is a real danger that significant central government presence in an area can disproportionately affect how people vote. My area of Helensburgh is a prime example of this, where the perception, however false it may be, that the naval base is the principal economic driver dictates how many people who have no personal involvement in the base vote. With the advance of globotics, home and online working and technological advance, the actual number of civil servants who will work out of physical offices in the near future will be very small. So the hope of staff living where a department is physically based and contributing to the local economy simply does not follow. My concern is that the resolution creates the possible subliminal perception that we shall be a centralised state, insofar as Holyrood will have a firm and overriding grasp of policy on housing, education, environment, employment, business development, and even health and social security, instead of empowering local authorities to do so. Instead, what should happen is that the 30 bureaucracies which currently serve our councils should be separate from the political council administrations and become 32 standalone public service bureaux which develop further expertise by also being institutes of higher learning, research and innovation with which our local political councils can contract for services. Individual communities of all sizes can then decide by local referenda to form their own councils, so we might have 200 or more councils which will contract with 32 Public Service Bureau to provide the means and expertise to deliver each council's policies. This will create important centres of public expertise in every part of Scotland, with communities empowered to design and develop their own policies without diktat from Holyrood ministers or central government civil servants, and can even challenge central government thinking, because at some time in the future, another government which we don't support may be in power in Holyrood. Direct democracy can be part of this by regular local referenda. Most of the funding for these new bureau and the council's budgets can be raised locally by councils setting their own rates of annual ground floor and roof rent without Holyrood interference. If we want to develop our active democracy, we have to empower local communities and reduce Holyrood power and ability to micromanage. That can only be done through every region of Scotland, in professional expertise, publicly owned but not under the control of overbearing influence of central government and its employees. So I ask you to reject this resolution, and by so doing, tell our leaders we demand a Scotland where devolution of power and administrative power, political and administrative power, and professional expertise is spread as widely as possible, so it is ingrained in our body politic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. And Graham was our final speaker on that resolution, delegates. So we will go ahead and vote now. So for resolution number 10, the Independent Scotland Civil Service, please locate your voting buttons and please vote now.
Okay, so the delegates are voting now on that proposal from Tim Rideout and other branches on the Scotland Civil Service after independence. There were essentially two elements to the discussion there. First of all, let's look at total numbers. Now, Tim Rideout pointed out that independent countries about the size of Scotland typically have somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 civil servants. When you look at the number of civil servants in Scotland just now, we have to add, first of all, those 7,500 or so who work directly for the Scottish Government. And then there's also about 25,000 who work for the UK Government in Scotland, for example, in the Ministry of Defence offices or in the East Kilbride Tax Office. So adding those together, you've got about 32,500 here at the moment. So that means we're about 10,000 light, something like that. So the first point is that independent Scotland would need to take on something like another 10,000 civil servants. So that wasn't really controversial. The next point is that Tim Rideout then goes on to say these new jobs should be dispersed throughout Scotland. He said, first of all, we have 32 local authority council areas in Scotland, so those 32 should each get a reasonable population percentage of the civil service jobs. And he said, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture, no reason why that should be in Edinburgh. Why shouldn't it be in Dumfries? He gave other examples of other ministries that could be in Aberdeen or Dundee. So that was the basis of Tim Rideout's idea that we, first of all, recruit a sufficient number of civil servants, maybe another 10,000, but then secondly, we don't put them all in Edinburgh or Glasgow. He went on to argue that we don't just population distribute them, but we should also give an extra 20% uplift. There should be more jobs to places which have no civil service jobs at all at the moment. And another speaker argued that places like Golspie or Dingwall, which are struggling to hold jobs at the moment, those are the sort of places which could really benefit from these extra jobs, and that could help to arrest their population decline. Okay, now against that, there was a speaker from down Helmsborough Way, I think, Mr. McCormick, suggested that what we really needed to do is not just to bung a few jobs here and there, but he's really in favour of a complete new model for local government and for local democracy. It sounds like what Mr. McCormick was proposing was a kind of a beefed up super local democracy with all of the 32 council areas having greater say, having greater control over all aspects of life, instead of being a kind of a lower tier compared to the ministries. That seems to be what he's saying. So he wants a stronger local government, which each of those local governments more empowered with more responsibilities and furthermore under more democratic accountability. So he suggested, Graham McCormick suggests, local referenda. So beefed up local councils with a wider range of responsibilities, a wider remit, and that's accountable to the population by having regular referenda on their areas particularly. Okay, so that's what the conference is voting on. So we'll hear whether the amendment attracted a lot of support, and then whether the general report from Tim Rideout, proposal from Tim Rideout and others was backed. Okay, and that's coming on in a few seconds. So let's hear from Kirsten Oswald, and we'll hear what the results are. Okay, so Kirsten Oswald will be again announcing that result in just a few seconds once she's compiled the numbers. The proposal of the civil service discussion there, Tim Rideout, we will be hearing from him again tomorrow. As he said, he is an economist, and he's one of the people proposing the Scottish Central Bank. We'll hear about that tomorrow.
Thank you very much, delegates. And for resolution number 10, the Independent Scotland Civil Service, with 346 votes in favour and 64 against, the resolution passes substantially. So let's go on now, delegates, to the next resolution. So that is resolution number 11, which is entitled Connecting Dumfries and Galloway. And that will be proposed by Daniel Hooper-Jones of Newton Stewart branch, who's a first-time speaker at conference, and seconded by Councillor Katie Hagman. So welcome to Daniel and to Katie.
Thank you, convener. Hello, conference. My name is Daniel Hooper-Jones. I am the Political Education Officer for the Newton Stewart branch of the Scottish National Party down in Dumfries and Galloway. For those of you who may be visually impaired, I'm wearing a sort of forest green jumper. I have dark hair, and I'm also wearing a very adorable belted Galloway cow beanie hat handmade in my hometown of Newton Stewart. Conference, I not only have the pleasure to move this life-changing resolution today, but I also have the pleasure to be here, albeit virtually, representing the thousands of voices living in Dumfries and Galloway who are in desperate need of improved infrastructure. Connecting Dumfries and Galloway is my branch's attempt to change the way we as a party do politics in the South and to finally open up our region to rail investment and construction. I hope you, as colleagues from all across our nation, can recognise our desire to be more ambitious with our plans, not only for the sake of our party's success, but also for the sake of our people. Conference, I do not remember a time in which our party did not run the government of my nation. I, as a young person, am so lucky to have grown up with a government that genuinely cares for its future generations. However, I cannot help but feel there is an element of inequality of opportunity in my region of Dumfries and Galloway. To sum it up in simple terms, I think there's a general frustration of the inaction of our governments. We look north to the Central Belt and see greater economic prosperity, government investment, and a young population. In comparison, Galloway feels forgotten. For example, with education, how is someone like me, a student, supposed to stay in the region and complete a university degree when we have just 2 small buses travelling the whole 70 miles between our 2 largest towns of Dumfries and Stranraer, a journey which takes well over 2 hours to complete? Without a rail link, our region is losing hundreds of young citizens every year. Think about what that does, not only to our demographics, but the knock-on effect on our economy. This is an ageing population crisis. A rail link is the simple answer. It is the smart, modern, and environmentally friendly solution to the issues Dumfries and Galloway faces. If we as a party are to look forward to the future for Dumfries and Galloway, we must adapt to it. The climate crisis hits Dumfries and Galloway hard. So let's change our way. Our new cooperation agreement with the Scottish Greens prioritises rail as the most important form of transport. Let's set an example to the world and show that Scotland is serious about action on climate change. Furthermore, rail has the potential to be used as an effective means of transportation and exportation of produce. Dumfries and Galloway produces 30% of Scotland's annual timber harvest, yet the region has no effective means of transporting timber. Having a rail system that could transport timber, as well as potentially taking produce straight from the Belfast-Cairnryan ferry, would take masses of strain caused by lorries off the roads. Colleagues, I want to wrap up by taking a step back and considering my home region's place in our party. I joined the SNP at age 15 because we are the party of Scotland. And the truth is, and regrettably some of us may be forgetting this, Dumfries and Galloway is just as Scottish as anywhere else in our nation. And at a time like now, when people of Scotland are waking up to the United Kingdom's constitutional injustices, it is vital that we don't leave any of our beloved corners of Scotland behind. Dumfries and Galloway is Scotland. So let's start investing in it like it's Scotland. Let's show the people that they deserve better than absent Tories and false promises. Let's show the people that their future lies within a normal, independent nation, not within a union of unequals. Conference, Dumfries and Galloway is getting there. Give us time and give us love, and we will be on your side. I'd like to close by thanking my amazing branch in Newton Stewart, as well as the supporting branches of Castle Douglas and Glenkens, Thurso and District, and the Carrick, Cumnock and Doon Valley Constituency Association. I'd like to give a special thanks to the best local councillor on the planet, Katie Hagman, who I believe is seconding this resolution. She'll be coming on right after me. And I'd also like to quickly mention that I'm running for a Policy Development Committee representative for South Scotland. So if you're joining us from the South and like the sound of ambitious policies informed by the experience of someone who grew up under the SNP, then please consider voting for me. Thank you so much, Conference. Please, please, please support this resolution. It's so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Conference, and thank you to Daniel for speaking on and proposing this positive and ambitious resolution from Newton Stewart branch. As the local ward councillor and as someone who is hugely supportive of this campaign, I'm delighted to formally second the resolution before you. For those of you that know me, it will come as no surprise when I describe myself as someone who is positive, enthusiastic and optimistic. However, I often hear cries that Dumfries and Galloway is the forgotten part of Scotland. And yes, it is difficult to argue that point when there are at times little mention of us in some of the national announcements made. But I'm delighted that today you fellow delegates here at our national conference have chosen to put Dumfries and Galloway on the agenda. So thank you. I want to quote Kevin Stewart at this point in regards to our fourth national planning framework. He has said, and I quote, "Our ambitious targets for addressing climate change demand a fresh approach and significant investment in infrastructure." I would propose that this resolution is exactly on point. And just last week in discussions at Council, I was delighted to welcome that our new local development plan should aspire, and again I quote, to preserve disused rail lines for future public transport needs. To give a very brief example of one of the difficulties many face within our region, I will speak with personal experience. My son, who attends our national music school in Edinburgh, is unable to make the 119-mile journey home of a weekend. We have looked at buses, we have looked at trains, and it is simply not possible for him to return that short distance. Reinstating the railway lines within Dumfries and Galloway will take a huge investment, but as we move to more sustainable, more economically viable solutions for the future, this motion will set the direction of travel. It will open up our region economically and socially, and our brilliant offering in tourism will also be enhanced. Conference, please support the resolution before you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Daniel. And Conference, our next speaker on this resolution is Killian Riley from Glasgow Provan branch. And Killian is speaking in favour of the resolution and is a first-time speaker at Conference. So welcome, Killian.
Good afternoon, Conference. When I saw this resolution on the agenda today, I felt compelled to speak in favour of it. You see, Conference, I'm one of the many, many young people who've left the region to settle elsewhere. I was born and raised in Dumfries and Galloway. It's a beautiful area and a wonderful place to grow up. It's a wonderful place to grow up until you reach the age where you start to think about what you want to do with your future. There's a perception that I know I had, and that I believe that many of my peers share, that there's a lack of opportunity in the region. Whether this is accurate in truth is irrelevant, because the perception alone was enough to push us to leave. Dumfries and Galloway is a vast region peppered with small towns and villages. It's a beautiful place to visit, but it can become very easy for those living there to become quite isolated. For people who don't drive, it can be very difficult to get around. Without a car, visiting friends and family or accessing services that are only available in the bigger towns can be very difficult. Those who don't drive are left relying on slow and infrequent buses to get around. I'm sure you see how this leaves so many at a disadvantage. Young people, people with disabilities, and those on low incomes, to mention a few. Improving the region's rail infrastructure would not only improve accessibility for those who live there. I know many of us who live in the Central Belt benefit greatly from the easy access we have to the Highlands, the East Coast and the Ayrshire Coast through a well-connected rail network. However, if you wanted to visit the beautiful Solway Coast or the vast Galloway Forest Park, you're out of luck. Creating infrastructure to make these places easy to access and attractive to visitors would benefit locals, tourists and day trippers alike. It's also worth noting, Conference, that rail can transport a lot more than people. Any feasibility study carried out should also look at the benefits that could be gained by moving all the freight that's currently destined for Northern Ireland travelling along the A75 and lorries onto rail. Movement of goods onto rail would help ease some of the congestion issues that we see on the A75 and could help avoid the need to dual this particular stretch of road in future. I'm sure I don't need to tell you how much better that would be for the environment. In conclusion, I believe that the economic and social benefits of improving the rail infrastructure in Dumfries and Galloway would go a long way towards changing the perception of the region. Bold action may be enough to stop the next generation of young people like me from moving away and may encourage some of us to come home. I would like to thank those that brought this resolution forward and urge you to vote in favour today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Killian. And Killian was our last speaker on this resolution, delegates, so we will now move to voting. So for resolution number 11, which is entitled Connecting Dumfries and Galloway, please cast your votes now.
Okay, so that's the second motion being discussed this afternoon at the SNP's conference, and delegates are voting on it now. Delegates heard that Dumfries and Galloway is an area where it's pretty difficult to get about if you don't have a car. We heard from Killian, who was born and brought up in Dumfries and Galloway and who's now living in Provan in the east end of Glasgow. Now, Killian was saying that it's pretty much understood when you're at secondary school in Dumfries and Galloway that you're probably not going to stay there. You're probably going to move to get a job or to go to university. And he's saying, let's improve the transport infrastructure. Let's make it easier for people to move about. And maybe young people will stay, and maybe some people like Killian might be encouraged to go back home again. The earlier speaker, Daniel, who introduced the proposal, which is all about improved rail transport, specifically rail transport for the Dumfries-Galloway region. Daniel said, let's spend a bit more money, let's spend a bit more investment on Dumfries, and maybe we will reciprocate by, not voting so many Conservatives. I think that's what he was talking about. But Daniel's proposal was not just on car transport, it was really specifically on rail transport. And I think this comes as a contrast to what we reported on yesterday, which was the UK government saying that they're going to spend money on the A75 and on the A1 between Newcastle and Edinburgh. So the UK government report, which we've had a brief look at yesterday, a centralised London level is saying this is what you're going to get. You're going to get a beefed up A75. Now, what the proposals here are saying is that really we've got to remember that it's not just the problem of relative underpopulation, there's not just a problem of not enough investment going into Dumfries and Galloway, but we really can't just forget about the climate agenda. And in fact, when I looked through the UK government report yesterday, I was astonished that the climate agenda is nowhere near the top. They do mention it, but it's not the first thing they talk about. In fact, the first thing in the UK government report on transport, I'm referring to the UK Net, which was announced yesterday, the first priority seems to be politically keeping the UK together. However, Daniel and the other proposals of this motion have said their priority is rail transport, is green, low-carbon transport as the way to reinvest in the communities of Dumfries and Galloway. So I think there's a clear contrast there, and also there's a question of who actually makes decisions about the transport infrastructure for that area. Obviously, road and rail, trunk roads and ScotRail are the responsibility of the Scottish Parliament. So again, the UK government report out yesterday is really ignoring the Scottish Parliament. It was saying we need to have a strategic overview of transport within the UK, but they did so without even consulting the Scottish Parliament. So the SNP yesterday said simply in response to that report that trunk road is a devolved responsibility in Scotland. So if there is a need to improve connectivity across the border, then maybe the London Parliament and the Scottish Parliament should talk about it instead of one just telling the other one that's how it's going to be. So we've heard from three speakers with connections to Dumfries and Galloway that area does need more investment and it does need better transport. Try, for example, getting to the Galloway Forest Park, or try getting to the beautiful Solway coast. Hardly any railway links in that whole area. Okay, so we're just The delegates have now cast their votes, and shortly we will be going back to Kirsten Oswald, who's holding the whole conference together for the SNP. Kirsten Oswald, by the way, is a Member of Parliament for East Renfrewshire, and she's kind of anchoring the online conference. So in just a few seconds, we're going to go back to Kirsten.
Thank you, Conference. And for resolution number 11, which was entitled Connecting Dumfries and Galloway, the resolution passes overwhelmingly with 395 votes in favour and 7 against. So Conference will now move on to the next resolution, which is resolution number 12, and it is entitled Putting Just Transition to Work. And this resolution will be proposed by Simon Barrow and seconded by Bill Ramsey, both of the SNP Trade Union Group. So welcome, Simon and Bill.
Conference, this motion is about how we translate urgently needed action to tackle the climate emergency into a concrete plan to provide employment and a sustainable economic future for the communities which will be most affected by those changes. Make no mistake, transition away from fossil fuel dependency is a huge task. It's not simply a matter of role replacement, it impacts people's lives in every way: livelihood, location, transport, production, and workers' rights. Nor is it only about male industrial jobs. Women and the service sector will be significantly affected too. In short, just transition can't happen on a wing in a prayer. It requires a roadmap and detailed planning. The challenges faced in the North East make that very clear and must be a priority in handling transition in the right way. In this motion, we highlight the key requirement for a register of jobs affected and for a regular reporting mechanism which enables government to measure progress and make the adjustments and the interventions required. This involves identifying the number of jobs within the carbon-intensive economy which need to be transitioned, the number of jobs being decarbonised, the number of jobs targeted for future just transition, the number justly transitioned since the last report, the number lost in the high carbon sector out with just transition with remedial action identified, and an update on progress towards both interim and final plans for the completion of just transition. As part of that process, we warmly welcome the amendment calling for a national skills framework to identify the skills required as green jobs come on stream regionally. All of this needs to involve workers and trade unions alongside communities, expert NGOs and businesses as key partners in developing and implementing a transition that is truly just. Now, of course, Conference, the wider debate on this motion is the need to develop an industrial strategy along the pathway to a well-being economy. And that's something we lack at present and which the SNP Trade Union Group is committed to helping the party achieve. Equally, as part of the new energy mix which will define Scotland's future, we need action on a renewables-based, publicly owned energy generating company, which our party conference has now called for twice, and which is about helping to push the whole sector in the right direction. That direction involves harnessing the immense natural resources Scotland possesses to achieve a prosperous, a sustainable and an economically just future for all. The capacity to achieve that cannot be in doubt. Scotland has around 35% of Europe's on and offshore renewable energy potential. However, the real issue is who will own and control these resources. Here we need two things. One, our energy and industrial potential in Scotland's hands, not in those of transnational capital. And two, the powers of independence. That is how we ensure that the transition is genuinely just, that there can be no going back to the devastation wreaked by Thatcherite deindustrialisation. A successful case for independence must incorporate the message that Scotland's renewable resources must truly benefit the Scottish people, the opposite of what happened with the UK's asset stripping of our oil and gas. We must distinguish between what can be achieved with the limited powers we currently have and the full powers that only independence achieves. Conference, in passing this motion, the SNP is moving decisively from being a party of oil to being a party of just transition. And if oil is to be left in the ground, as it must be, then our green transition has to be real, not just an aspiration. Please support both the motion and the amendment.
Good afternoon, Conference. Bill Ramsey, Southside Central and Trade Union Group. Because the Scottish National Party seeks to win electoral contests in numbers that can deliver a successful independence referendum, our policy on a just transition must have real electoral utility. Absent this element of electoral utility, it's of no use to us in achieving our goal of independence. The SNP version of a just transition must therefore go beyond warm words, something that to an extent our party has been, in my view, particularly adept at over the recent period. Our policy on this issue must convince many of those who perceive just transition as potentially an unjust transition. We must be able to point to real life examples, not theoretical opportunities. We must be able to point to real life examples of folk moving from jobs in the carbon intensive economy to jobs in the green economy. Moreover, the number of these jobs must be very large, not in dozens, but in thousands. Although our motion says we can include consultation with trade unions, actually we must include consultation with trade unions. We also say we should consult with business, of course. However, we must be sure that business, particularly very big business, does not lead us by the nose. Our businesses, our big businesses, was the biggest group by far at COP26. But they are no more capable of delivering a winning majority for independence than produce solutions to avoid 4 degrees of warming, which for some of them is their real target. But more of that on other occasions that will be offered up by the Trade Union Group in 2022 as we move out of the stunted COVID context of political discourse that we are unfortunately still in now. And finally, colleagues, as environmental partners we reference, we must, by example, show them that the SNP is an open social democratic electoral vehicle, as opposed to the Parliamentary Office of the Environmental Movement, that can take forward what has become the prime political directive for the rest of this century and more, addressing the growing threat of climate chaos, which as of now is on course to cause geopolitical instability, the likes of which humankind has not experienced for at least 10 millennia. Thank you, Conference. Please support.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to Simon. Delegates, our next speaker, speaking in favour of the resolution, is Kat Carey from Edinburgh Central Branch. Welcome to Kat.
Thank you, Convener. And thank you to the committee and the delegates for the opportunity to speak in favour of this resolution. For Scotland, like all nations, day-to-day life will continue to change in the coming years because of climate change. This year's COP26 in Glasgow has made it clear that our domestic climate targets in progress towards meeting them continues to be world-leading, receiving attention from other countries, states, and institutions. But we are still, unfortunately, constrained by a UK Tory government who have made it clear that the quality of life of the people who live here is of little concern to them. In this, the just transition to net zero represents another area where we can make the case for independence through progressive policy. Support for independence is so high among younger people in part because the SNP-led Scottish government has made it clear that they will have a brighter future in an independent Scotland. This resolution sends a message that the SNP puts the welfare of people living in Scotland at the forefront of every issue, that the just transition will not be another opportunity for eco-capitalists to squeeze more profits in the name of climate justice. Conference, as a proud member of the Aberdeen independence movement, I have heard from people who have worked in the oil and gas sector their whole lives. Although most of them cannot ignore the reality of climate change, they're concerned that they will be left behind and that they have no future. By listening to their concerns, we can identify areas where the just transition could improve, such as abbreviated cross-training opportunities for greener jobs that are related to their original fields. Similarly, by listening to the many women, minority ethnic, and disabled people who are already at a social and economic disadvantage, we can build a green energy sector with equity and social justice for everyone. Making the just transition work in its practical application represents another vital leadership role for Scotland internationally. It also sets out the type of independent country that we intend to be. This is the time to make big structural changes that work for everyone in Scotland, and this resolution sets out a process through which the just transition will do just that. I hope you will join me in supporting it today.
Thank you, Kat. And delegates now speaking for the resolution, we have Robbie Mochrie from Clydebank branch. And Robbie is the first time speaker at conference. So welcome to Robbie.
Conference. So far this afternoon, we have heard John Swinney talking about the route map for recovery from COVID-19. And you have also approved a resolution calling for the Scottish Civil Service to be distributed across the country. These are important matters, but they pale into insignificance compared with the task of managing and mitigating the effects of climate change. This is a matter of justice in many ways, and this resolution in particular emphasises the interests of labour in job creation, in high wages, and in good working conditions. Scotland will be transitioning from being a stateless nation to a nation state at the same time as the world will be in transition from carbon intensive to sustainable energy sources. This is a real moment of opportunity. As a new state, Scotland will have a unique opportunity to set up institutions which are encouraging and enabling of that transition. We cannot wait until Independence Day, whenever that may be, to start this work. The government is about to launch its economic transformation strategy. While it cannot state this explicitly, woven throughout that strategy will be a clear case for independence, because it will demonstrate the extent to which devolution is unstable and Scotland needs to be unshackled. Now, recent economic research indicates that Scotland has a surprisingly high number of universal credit claimants. Surprisingly high because the only explanation is that we have too many jobs which are both low paid or part-time. And we have lopsided development. We've already heard this afternoon about how sustainability is a rural as well as an urban problem. Underlying all of this are weaknesses within Scotland's economy. It has not been good enough at creating businesses, and it has not been good enough at creating jobs. In spite of this, we have an excellent infrastructure for invention. Too often, though, we export our knowledge, we export our opportunities. So to address these problems, economic strategy must embrace just transition. Conference, in voting for this resolution, we urge the government to start work now. We can already be living in the early years of a better nation. Thank you.
Many thanks, Robbie. And Conference, our next speaker on this resolution, speaking in favour of the resolution, is Councillor Graham Campbell. So welcome to Graham.
Thank you, Kirsten, and welcome delegates and conference. I'm writing to support this resolution for some very obvious reasons which my colleagues have already pointed out. It is absolutely essential that just transition is supported and actually understood and indeed adopted by the population, by business, by the trade unions, by everybody in society. And this motion obviously tries to detail the process of how we would measure that very, very specifically and make sure we meet our target to meet that transition away from fossil fuel-based economies. However, one of the things that I think you'll see in the amendment being put following by my colleagues in Edinburgh Council is that we need to have skills. We need to have skills development in order that we can have those technologies developed and used and jobs created and jobs taken up. But one of the things we've already passed in conference before is the Scottish National Infrastructure Company. That was something that was considered by our commission on infrastructure, and unfortunately it was rejected. And it's actually one of the main ways in which we can actually deliver the urgency that we need to get just transition delivered in time to properly meet our obligations to stop climate change and the temperature rising. You know, we are one of the few countries in the world probably in the position to go 100% renewable within a short space of time. And that's the kind of leadership that Scotland has tried to show at COP26, like my Brazilian colleagues have asked here above my shoulder, that they need urgent action from developed countries, that just transition can't leave the poor and the working class behind, and it's got to involve skills transfer to new industries and jobs. They need to be based somewhere, and they also need to have the skills kept together in an infrastructure company so that we can deliver these major transformative public projects. So I'm asking you to support the motion and obviously to support the amendment to it as well when that comes up. But let's make our just transition real, because we cannot do it with the current economic base and economic methods, because we have to recognize that the construction industry is one of the big polluting elements in this. Unless we clean that up and clean up the process in which go to making that industrial process happen, we will not achieve the carbon climate change reductions that we need. Thank you, conference.
Thank you, Graham. And delegates, next to propose the amendment to resolution number 12, we have Councillor Kate Campbell, and to second the amendment, we have Councillor Eleanor Bird. So welcome to both of them.
Conference, we've all just spent 2 weeks watching our First Minister, front and centre, showing the world that Scotland is a serious nation with a serious agenda and a world leader on climate change. For us to meet our carbon targets, we must develop green industries, and we must develop the skills of the people who will enable those industries to grow and to thrive. We've all seen the impact on sectors from Brexit, where businesses are not able to open, not because of a lack of demand, but simply because they can't get the staff. The industries that we need will not develop without the workforce to enable it. But it's more than just about creating a workforce, it's about who has access to the skills. We know that as we move to different ways of building, of heating homes, of transport and energy production, some of the old jobs won't exist anymore. And many of the old jobs are highly skilled. For the just transition to be just, we must start to map that out and to understand where people can move to within the new skills landscape that will emerge. There needs to be support for businesses to pivot, but crucially for people to retrain. Think about gas engineers, highly technically skilled, but we are going to have to phase gas out. We can't expect people in their 20s, 30s, 40s and 50s to start from scratch at entry-level jobs and leave behind the successful businesses that they have spent years of their life building up. So we need to understand in quite granular detail what the opportunities for them are, and then we need to make those opportunities accessible to them. I know from the work that we're doing in Edinburgh that we'll need armies of people trained in whole house retrofit, and we understand a fair amount about what that will look like in terms of energy efficiency, but we're some way off understanding what the heat source solutions will be, particularly for areas like tenement buildings. Other cities will be facing similar challenges, but then for other parts of Scotland, it will be different. There'll be a focus on renewables in some areas, or transport, or sustainable agriculture. It's complicated. And we can't pretend that we have all of the answers now, because we just don't. But that's why it's so important that there's a coordinated and strategic plan to map this out and to react and respond as technology, sectors and skills emerge. And we also don't want to train lots of people in jobs that actually aren't needed in the region where they want to live. Councillor Eleanor Bird, who is the Young People's Champion at Edinburgh Council, will be seconding, so I'll let her go into the detail of why this is so important for young people. But I wanted to say that we all know that they have suffered. They've lost opportunities and they've lost the start of their adult lives. And they've also been at the forefront of demanding climate action. So we owe it to them to provide them with the opportunities to be part of that change and to build their careers around all of our greener future. And this is important now because, quite rightly, to support economic recovery, the Scottish Government is investing in skills and training, and we need to spend that money and we need to spend it urgently. But that also gives us the opportunity to direct that money to a green recovery, so that we aren't just supporting people into jobs that exist now, but we're supporting people to get the skills for the jobs of the future. Much of this funding is directed through local employability partnerships, local government, colleges and universities. We need to develop a clear national picture so that at a local and regional level, these partnerships have the information they need to understand where best to direct resources, locally, but also how that fits into the national plan. And that's why when we talk about the just transition, it can't just be about jobs. Skills are absolutely crucial, and our government has so much power to influence and shape access to skills and training across Scotland. Conference, please support this amendment, because it is absolutely vital that we support the just transition by making sure that we have the skilled workforce to make it happen, that everyone has access to opportunities for skills and training to become part of that workforce, and that we use the money that we're spending now on economic recovery to make it happen.
We know that young people have been one of the groups worst affected by the pandemic. A UK-wide study published in August of last year found that young people were amongst the hardest hit psychologically by the effects of the COVID-19 lockdown. As Young People's Champion for Edinburgh, I have seen firsthand the sheer tenacity of young people in challenging the injustices they face on a daily basis, such as the blight of zero-hours contracts and the erosion of employment rights as a result of a right-wing Brexit, to say nothing of the damage of the last 10 years of ideological Tory austerity that's impacted the early lives of far too many of them. Skills Development Scotland are mapping out participation in skills, training and employment, and although across Scotland the figures are generally encouraging, there are still areas where participation of young people is low and they're not being presented with the right opportunities for them. Just this week, we saw the new Scottish Youth Parliament announced, with swathes of fresh and returning MSYPs elected to stand up for young people and the issues that matter most to them. And when has this been more important than now? As my colleague Councillor Kate Campbell said in proposing, young people have been at the forefront of demanding action on climate change and have articulated very clearly their expectations and our responsibilities to the planet and future generations. Nowhere have we heard the voice of young people more loudly than at COP26, where world leaders gathered to find solutions and explore the difficult decisions that are needed to ensure our children and their children have a sustainable environment not only to grow up in, but to thrive in. I'm proud that this SNP government has made Scotland a world leader on climate action, but as our First Minister has outlined, we need to keep acting and keep doing more. The just transition must mark our commitment to our young people and our resolve to give back some of what they have lost to the pandemic. We know the value that the Scottish Government places on the contribution of young people and has invested in them through the Young Persons Guarantee, committing millions to supporting young people into work and trying to undo some of the damage caused by Brexit and COVID-19. I warmly welcome the Scottish Government's work on a Green Jobs Workforce Academy and development of a Green Internship Scheme programme to upskill the young workforce. It is imperative that young people have a seat at the table and access to the necessary skills to be part of the systemic change that's required. We owe it to them to make sure that they do. It is a big task, and to achieve it, we must harness their energy and passion. By providing young people with the training and by creating opportunities for lasting, fulfilling and economically rewarding careers in sectors that will be here for years to come, we will get it right. It's vital that the funding that must be spent now also supports a just transition, and that every young person can access the skills and training that will best equip them and our planet for the future. Conference, please support the amendment.
Thank you very much, Ellie and Kate, who are our final speakers for Resolution 12. So we will now move on to voting, delegates. So we'll firstly vote on the amendment before we move on and look at the resolution. So for the amendment to Resolution 12, putting just transition to work, can I ask that you find your voting buttons and vote now, please?
Okay, so 2 votes here. Conference delegates are discussing Proposition 12, which concerns the just transition away from oil and gas jobs and towards the new low-carbon economy. Now, because there's an amendment to this proposal, which we've heard moved by Graham Campbell, Ellie Bird and Katie Campbell, delegates first of all have to vote on the amendment, and if that's passed, they then go on to vote on the full motion. So first of all, on the amendment, I'll read out what it says. It's quite brief. Conference agrees that a roadmap to a just transition should include a national skills framework which identifies the skills needed as new green jobs come on stream. This framework should have regional plans developed in conjunction with local authorities, higher and further education bodies. These should set out the skills that will be needed over a 5-year period and develop regional skills programmes which will support the growth of the green economy and ensure that there's access to training and skills development for those who need it. So the amendment is about a framework for making sure that people have the skills needed and for putting that in a 5-year timescale. Now, speaking for the amendment, Ellie Bird, who's the Young People's Champion for Edinburgh, talked about young people on the one hand as being those who are in the front of the campaign for climate change, but on the other hand pointed out that young people are often at the brunt of low-paid jobs or precarious jobs with short-term contracts. So she and other proposers of the amendment are emphasising that the new jobs can't be rubbish jobs, they must be highly skilled and jobs that you can actually build a career on. So we've got to fight, first of all, for climate justice, but also we've got to make sure that the new green economy is underpinned by proper, high-skilled, permanent jobs. On that point, Katie Campbell said that it's really not easy to talk to people who have been in an oil and gas job for a while or who have maybe worked up a business or worked up a career and then say to them that you're going to have to move away from that. So again, Katie Campbell was emphasising that the necessity to have a skills framework to make it easier for people to transition away from oil and gas. I didn't know earlier on if transition was a verb, but I think having heard a few speakers use it today, I think we'll have to accept that it has now joined the language. Okay, so also Councillor Graham Campbell, who's a Glasgow councillor, also he first of all proposed the amendment, and again he's emphasising that jobs and skills are part of the just transition. All speakers, of course, have been using the just transition language to contrast, of course, this really historic shift away from oil and gas to 40, 30 years ago, the shift away from coal towards oil and gas. You might remember North Sea gas became the new thing when Britain transitioned away from coal. But of course, that move away from coal in the 80s was absolutely nothing to do with climate change and was entirely to do with the Conservative government's war against the National Union of Mine Workers. So speakers today and others previously have said, well, that was one type of transition that the Conservatives carried out in the 80s. And that was not just mining communities in Scotland, north of England, Midlands of England are still suffering from that transition today. So everyone's contrasting that and saying this is a transition that we're going to organise, that we're going to be on top of. So let's plan it strategically and let's see that this transition can be done properly with government planning, knowing that it's moving towards a better outcome. So it's all about skills, making sure those people have skills to move into the new green economy. Okay, so shortly we're going back to Kirsten Oswald to hear the results of the amendment vote. Okay, so here's Kirsten Oswald, and we'll first of all here have delegates voted for the amendment on a 5-year skills programme.
Thank you very much, delegates. And the amendment to resolution number 12, putting just transition to work, passes overwhelmingly by 384 votes to 9. So conference, we now go on to vote on the resolution as amended. So on resolution number 12, putting just transition to work as amended, please cast your vote now.
Okay, so as you will have heard, on Proposition 12, which is on the transition to green jobs, conference delegates have now backed the amendment, which is a just transition national skills framework, which plans the transition and the development of new skills through local further education colleges and universities, and puts that on a 5-year framework to make sure that people, as they move out of the old oil and gas economy, have actually got proper jobs and the skills to supply those jobs. So delegates are now back to the main proposition, which is on the main proposition is on moving towards the just transition, and it's called putting the just transition to work. So conference delegates have been asked to recognise that a prosperous and sustainable future for Scotland involves moving rapidly towards a modern post-carbon economy, which protects workers' livelihoods, creates a new industrial base, renews communities, and delivers a cleaner, greener and fairer nation for all. So the main path of motion, as amended with that extra 5-year skills transition, the main path of motion, really, I think it looks like that's going to become a major political split in Scotland between the SNP and the other parties. We've seen over the last few months that the leader of the Scottish Conservatives has now he's positioned himself politically as a champion of oil and gas. So the Tories have said, if you want to support oil and gas jobs, vote Tory. And the Tories, of course, have MPs in the North East. So this is really becoming a political battleground in Scotland. The Tories saying, if you don't want to lose your jobs in the oil gas sector, vote Tory. On the other hand, the Scottish Greens and the Scottish National Party are now beginning to say that was the old economy. And so really, in many ways, Proposition 12 here is saying this is a new economy, the new jobs, the new skills, the new green economy. That's the future. Oil and gas is the past. Now, this is actually, I think we're probably going to see this as a major shift, a major historical turning point right now, this weekend, because the First Minister has started to say in the last couple of weeks that really we should not be supporting the development of new oil. In particular, of course, the UK government, because the Scottish government doesn't have any control over Scotland's oil, of course. The UK government is still having to decide if it's going to develop the new oil field off Shetland. The Scottish government has now firmly come out against any new development. And of course, that's because just before the COP26 in Glasgow, the United Nations said, if we are going to have any chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees, then there must be no new oil and gas development. Like, not a difficult thing to understand, no new development. So the UK government has yet to make its mind up on that, but the Scottish Conservatives are the champions of oil. So the political split really is in Scotland is becoming, are you pro-oil or are you pro the new post-oil economy? So this week it looks like the SNP is now firmly positioning themselves for the first time as a party that says it was Scotland's oil, but from now on it's Scotland's renewable energies, it's Scotland's renewable resources and renewable technologies. So I think we can see it in that context, that this proposition number 12 is all about saying, yeah, we are now post-oil, and so we now got to start making a clear framework, making a clear plan to work out what jobs we need and where those skills will be and where those skills need to be developed. Okay, so I think that's becoming a clear political split. What way is Scottish Labour going to go? Are they for oil or against it? I'm not really sure from what they've been saying recently. But the SNP today, if they vote for this motion, are now saying we are now the party of green, low-carbon fuel. We are no longer the party of oil. And we'll go back shortly to Kirsten Oswald, who will announce the result of the vote for the amended Proposition 12.
Thank you very much, delegates. And resolution number 12, entitled Putting Just Transition to Work, as amended, passes overwhelmingly by 409 votes to 6. And now, conference, before our next resolution, we have a short video for you, all about Scotland as an independent country.
We're the ideal size to succeed. 7 of the 10 richest developed countries in the world have populations similar to or smaller than Scotland's. None of them have any natural advantages except one. They are independent, with control over their own economic policy. And Scotland has a big economy. Our national income in 2019 was £177 billion. That means we're richer per head than many wealthy countries, such as Italy, Japan, and New Zealand. Being an independent country within the EU would mean we'd be part of the EU single market, which is 7 times the size of the UK. Our manufacturing industry has gone global. We are already exporting more manufacturing goods to the EU and the rest of the world than to the rest of the UK. We are a renewable energy powerhouse, with 25% of all European offshore wind and tidal energy potential flowing through Scotland. We are at the cutting edge of the industries of the future. Our life sciences cluster is one of the biggest in Europe, and Glasgow has become the European capital of satellite technology. Scotland's food and drink sector is worth around £15 billion each year, with Scotch whisky alone accounting for more than 1/5 of all UK food and drink exports. Now, more than ever, it's vital that Scotland's future is in Scotland's hands. Our journey to independence has begun, and we're ready. Every single vote will count, but only you can make it happen. Pledge your support for Scottish independence at yes.scot.
Conference, let's now move to resolution number 13, which is entitled Estranged Students Guarantor Scheme. And this resolution will be proposed by Adam Chibuk of Eastwood Branch, and Adam is a first-time speaker at conference, and seconded by Gillian Martin, MSP. So welcome to them both.
Hello conference, it's great to join everyone today, albeit from the wonderfully exotic location of my living room. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you all and to move this important resolution at our 87th Annual National Conference. This week is Estranged Student Solidarity Week, which has been run by Standalone, the UK's estranged persons charity, for several years. In this week, it's time to reflect on the challenges posed by estrangement to those seeking to succeed in further and higher education. I'd like to ask conference to join me in sending our solidarity to estranged students in colleges and universities across the country. Know that we see you, we hear you, and we are committed to supporting you. For those who may not be familiar, estrangement is when an individual has no meaningful contact with their family. And in the context of education, this usually means they're not supported by them either. This poses a multitude of challenges to students, both large and small, which can affect their well-being, finances, accommodation, and more. I was first introduced to the concept of estrangement about 3 years ago, when a new friend told me about how she almost became homeless at uni. She told me she had no contact with her parents, and that meant she couldn't ask them to be her guarantor when she was looking to rent a flat. A simple act of familial support that many students, like myself, otherwise take for granted. This means she was put in an incredibly difficult position. Without access to reliable housing, she couldn't possibly focus on her uni work, and that could have left her both homeless and unable to complete her degree. My friend overcame the odds to achieve a place at university. After years of abuse and neglect, she left her family home at 16. She was told that she'd more like to see the inside of a prison than a university based on her circumstances. Despite this, she persevered and gained a place at the University of Glasgow. And even after overcoming all these barriers to attend university, something as simple as lacking a guarantor threatened her very ability to complete a life-changing journey through higher education. Fortunately, my friend was able to take advantage of the University of Glasgow's groundbreaking free and accessible guarantor scheme, providing her with the support to secure her accommodation. However, she was one of the lucky ones. Conference, we could fill the agenda for the next few days with stories from estranged students struggling to succeed in education. This often unheard and under-supported cohort needs more attention, and their key issues must be addressed. My friend was fortunate enough to benefit from the University of Glasgow's guarantor scheme, almost certainly the best in the country today. There are only 3 other guarantor schemes available in Scottish institutions, and they do not provide the same coverage as my friend received. Imagine then how much more difficult it would be for estranged students attending institutions where there's a complete lack of support. This is not good enough, and Scotland must do better. We welcome the Scottish Government has already taken steps in trying to recognise the challenges faced by estranged students by commissioning new research into this in January 2020. Look forward to seeing the results of this and further focus that needs to be on estranged students across Scotland. Conference, this resolution calls on the Scottish Government to work with colleges and universities to ensure that every institution has a free and accessible guarantor scheme that is open to estranged students. I'm extremely proud of our party's commitment to free and accessible higher education for all, regardless of background. But this commitment requires that we will always work to identify gaps in our current support system and act to fix them. This resolution highlights such a gap faced by strange students and emphasises the next steps that we need to take. Conference, it is in the spirit of strange student solidarity that I should support this resolution. Thank you very much.
I am delighted to second the resolution today. For 3 years now, I have campaigned alongside strange students and the brilliant charity Stand Alone to urge the Scottish Government to commit to a review of estranged student support in Scotland, which they have done. Estranged students are one of the most vulnerable groups of students, and we know how difficult the pandemic has been for so many people across the country and for students who've faced upheaval in being able to secure and find accommodation and attend university on campus. But for estranged students, this challenge has been made even harder. I've been moved by the many estranged students who've spoken to me over the years about the circumstances which has led to their estrangement from their parent or family. A large proportion of them are estranged due to their families not accepting their sexuality, for example, actively trying to bully them into submitting to a way of life incompatible with their true selves. Others have had chaotic upbringings, perhaps living in turmoil due to violence or neglect at home. Without family support or easy access to a guarantor, they are disproportionately vulnerable to poverty and homelessness. And despite all the challenges that they're up against, they somehow manage through hard work and determination to still achieve impressive exam results and get a place at university. So we cannot let their talent go to waste. One young woman told me that she did all her hires whilst living in a homeless hostel. And she's now fast on her way to qualifying in medicine, thanks in no small part to the student support in place at Glasgow University, who for many years have acted as guarantors for the estranged students. Previously, estranged students have either had to decline places at university because they have had no one behind them to act as guarantor for their rental accommodation. And some have told me that even they went and asked old teachers to stand in for where their parents should be. I want to touch in particular on ensuring support schemes is not only in place for the academic year, but for the whole year round and for a short period after graduation. Students need to have access to a safe living space, and often guarantor schemes only kick in for accommodation in student residential halls, which are only contracted to house students for 9 months of the year. This means that many students are at risk of becoming homeless in holiday periods, which is why I would like to encourage that strange students guarantor systems give them a choice in where they live. There are good reasons why they might not want to live in student accommodation. Understandably, their friends will be their support network, their new family, if you like. A shared flat, which is a consistent home, will be best for them. I cannot imagine how I would have made it through university without my parents' support. But for many, through no fault of their own, they are literally standing alone, and we must support them. Thank you, Conference.
Many thanks, Gillian, and thanks also to Adam. Delegates, our next speaker on this resolution, speaking for the resolution, is Councillor Colm Merrick. So welcome, Colm.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you, Adam, and thank you, Gillian. Good afternoon, Conference. I want to speak in favour of this resolution. There is a plethora of reasons why students may become estranged from their families or carers, but one common theme in such difficult and often tragic circumstances is that this is seldom the fault of the student. For example, family dialogue can break down, and before it can be realised, the original difference gets lost in the gathering momentum of argument. This in turn leaves the student additionally vulnerable on several fronts. And as this resolution clearly articulates, one of those vulnerabilities is not having a guarantor to enable them to access rented accommodation. In any case, what use is blame in the face of this need before us? Delegates, another common theme is that it is not for us or society to pass judgment on such alienations. Rather, our job is to encourage equality, equity, and effective inclusion for all our students. and to make sure no additional obstacles are put in their way. Also to remove any potential for exploitation, as the resolution also draws our attention to. Friends, throughout history, our Scottish educational institutions and students have enjoyed highly favourable repute. And here you have an opportunity to apply our progressive 21st century thinking and values towards the support of all our students. I ask you to vote for the resolution so that none of our students get left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Colm. And as Colm was our final speaker on this resolution, delegates, we will now go on and vote. So for resolution number 13, Estranged Students Guarantor Scheme, please cast your votes now.
The 13th. Okay, this is the 13th proposal, and conference delegates are voting on it just now. Number 13 reads the Estranged Students Guarantor Scheme. The principal subject of the motion is the ability of students who don't have family backing to actually sign a rental agreement. It's a commonly overlooked fact, but up until now, we hope that students who don't have family backing are going to find it very difficult to actually get accommodation. The movers of the motion suggest that universities should play a greater role in stepping in if students cannot find a guarantor for the accommodation. Less than half Scotland's universities and colleges have a guarantor scheme available. And so first of all, it should be essential that all universities take on that responsibility. So what this means is that if a student who has become, for one reason or another, estranged from their family is not able to get parental support and not able to get a parental signature for a financial dealing, then the university needs to provide somebody who will step into that role. So the university or the college themselves has to be the guarantor. Otherwise, students actually face homelessness. One of the movers, it was Gillian Martin, who's the MSP for Aberdeenshire East, said that even if students are able to get student accommodation on their own account, that doesn't usually give you 52 weeks a year accommodation. And she suggested that it's probably more suitable for students to have shared accommodation in a shared student flat then, or in some sort of shared ownership or shared rental responsibilities. But again, it's unlikely that a young person is going to be able to do that unless they can have the financial backup, the financial guarantee from the college. Another speaker, called Merrick, at the end there, asked, why do students become estranged from their families? There may be a whole range of reasons, he said, for that happening. But one thing we can be sure of is it's usually not the young person's fault. Who knows what sort of family disputes may have arisen some years ago, and for some reason it didn't get resolved and might even have become worse over the years. But in the end, the young student, the young person has to present themselves at university and try to get into the same sort of relationships and financial dealings that other students do. Again, Gillian Martin, MSP, said that she was not sure how she could have got through university without the backing of her parents. And she wonders, just how can anyone manage to do that on their own? We did hear from her and from other speakers, though, of success stories. In fact, Adam Cabot, who proposed the motion, was speaking really on behalf of a friend of his he knew at college, who he found out was actually on her own, had actually lost any meaningful contact with her family. But still, she and other estranged students whom the speakers referred to, have nonetheless been able to rise over that adversity and have been able to get full university careers and emerge qualified, in one case as a doctor. But they need the help of the universities. In fact, one student said that the Glasgow University has an excellent guarantor scheme for students who are estranged from their families. Okay, so we had 3 speakers for. No one spoke against this proposition, so very shortly we're going to move back to Kirsten Oswald, who will announce the results. Now, so thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to stay on till shortly after 4 today, and we'll do some more coverage of tomorrow's agenda after the lunchtime broadcast. So let's go back to Kirsten Oswald, and we'll hear the voting for proposition number 13 in a few seconds. Here's the vote now.
Thank you very much, Conference. And for resolution number 13, entitled Estranged Students Guarantor Scheme, the resolution passes overwhelmingly with 382 votes for and 7 against. So Conference will move on now to our next resolution, which is resolution number 14, and that is entitled Social Prescribing of Nature in Scotland. And it will be proposed by Serena Cowdy of Arbroath branch, and Serena is a first-time speaker at Conference, and seconded by Councillor Julie Bell. So welcome, Serena and Julie.
Delegates, Conference, I beg to move Resolution 14, Social Prescribing of Nature in Scotland, in the name of Arbroath and District Branch. This motion builds on the excellent work already done on social prescribing in Scotland and brings nature prescribing to the fore. As many of you will know, social prescribing enables GPs, nurses, and other primary care professionals to refer people to a range of local, non-clinical services to support their health and well-being. In my own local authority of Angus, it's great to see that in the last 18 months, 8 new social prescribers have been appointed. Employed by Voluntary Action Angus, they're based in GP practices and offer a range of non-clinical support to patients, including with financial issues, loneliness, and social isolation. I've volunteered as a Voluntary Action Angus telephone befriender since the start of the COVID pandemic, which I've learned is exactly the sort of service prescribed in this way. Social prescribers also support patients in connecting with local community resources. And there is so much evidence to show that interactions with nature in particular can have huge mental and physical health benefits. Recent research by the Mental Health Foundation has shown that spending time outdoors has been one of the key factors helping people battle depression and cope with stress during the pandemic. When questioned, some 45% of people said that visiting nature-rich green spaces had helped them cope. Sadly, deprived communities, especially those in urban areas, are the least likely to live near high-quality nature spaces. However, in Scotland, steps are being taken to connect urban communities with nature in this way. For example, through a collaboration between RSPB Scotland and Lothian's Health Foundation, GPs at 5 practices in Edinburgh are now able to prescribe nature to patients as part of their treatment. This project began as a pilot in Shetland in 2017 and was successfully rolled out to all 10 GP practices across Shetland in 2018. Both in Shetland and now in Edinburgh, RSPB Scotland has identified a range of local, nature-based activities which GPs can then prescribe as part of a patient's treatment plan. Suggested activities can be really simple and include everything from planting spring bulbs to watching a spider make a web. Nature prescription locations work best if they are genuinely biodiverse, free to use, accessible for all, clean, and have clear signage and species identification boards to optimize engagement and learning opportunities. An appropriate location could be a park, a woodland, community garden, coastal or riverside walk, or even a city cemetery. This resolution proposes it become a statutory obligation to have at least one such green space meeting all of these criteria in every local authority in Scotland. In practical terms, this isn't as challenging as it might appear. I would suggest that every local authority in Scotland either has a public space that already falls into this category, or one that needs limited modifications in order to qualify. For example, one space might be rich in biodiversity but require improvements around accessibility and signage. Another may have excellent facilities and accessibility, but needs support to boost its biodiversity. Having these designated nature prescriptions sites in every local authority would allow health professionals writing social prescriptions to direct patients to specific locations they know to be safe, of a high standard, and well suited to their needs. This linked up approach would also allow the Scottish Government to further demonstrate its commitment to key pledges focused on mental health support and on protecting and enhancing our natural habitats. Delegates, while ambitious, this proposal is achievable, and I believe it has the potential to help create a greener and happier nation. I hope you feel able to support this resolution. Thank you. I beg to move.
Hello, Conference. I'm a councillor on the Angus Health and Social Care Partnership Integrated Joint Board. We fund our third sector interface, Voluntary Action Angus, to deliver social prescribing, as Serena described, so I know it works. We funded VAA to deliver this for a number of reasons. Our pharmacy budget was way too high. There were too many people on over 10 different medications who were overdue a review, especially around certain meds. People were experiencing long-term depression, isolation, or living with chronic pain. In its first 6 months, the service received over 1,500 referrals from GPs. Our social prescribers use their skills to support people and refer them to various activities and projects, such as community gardens and allotments, befriending and walking groups. We have improved people's mental health, reduced their pain, reduced their isolation and loneliness, reduced reliance on medications and therefore cost, and feedback from participants is brilliant. Some have taken up volunteering themselves. We also use walks in nature and understanding the countryside code in our Angus Council Community Justice Services. Conference, we need to do more to reconnect people with our land. I'm a COSLA rep on Public Health Scotland, and one of our areas of focus is on improving many fundamental aspects of population health and well-being through place, including planning, housing, transport, use of green space, community engagement, and food sustainability. Please go check out the blogs on the PHS website. A PHS report by the Medical Research Council, Chief Scientist Office, and the Social and Public Health Science Unit at the University of Glasgow looked at green and open space use during spring year, still during COVID, and ongoing inequalities in use of green space, which dipped from lockdown 1. That report says almost 9 out of 10 of the people who participated in the research told us that being in green and open spaces benefited their mental health. It is vital that we consider how we provide neighbourhood green space, as alternative approaches may have different impacts on health and well-being and inequality. Serena's resolution calls for at least one nature prescription site in every local authority. Given the remote and rural nature of Scotland and the evidence base, I know we can do more because we know that nature heals. Conference, I am delighted to second this resolution. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Serena. Delegates, our next speaker, speaking in favour of the resolution, is Emily Ratcliffe of Meadows and Morningside branch. So welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Kirsten, and good afternoon, Conference. I'm speaking in favour of this motion because we know that mental health does not rely on only one thing. The brain, the mind, and society all play a role in our mental health, and frequently all must be addressed to support somebody's recovery from mental illness. Yet we still primarily equip mental health professionals and GPs with only an incomplete range of interventions to help their patients. Medication and short-term psychological interventions are effective, but you need a society that supports good mental health as well. Then the final area of social health, and particularly nature, is still neglected. We know access to nature, the peace and relaxation it provides, the opportunities for physical activity and community building play a substantial role in improving and maintaining mental health. Furthermore, when we think about health inequality, we know that access to nature is one of the many factors separating those with good health outcomes from those with poor ones. Yet, for all our new clinical knowledge, doctors' ability to act on it and include nature within a comprehensive and complete treatment plan is limited without access to these nature spaces. That limits the development of new services to use this knowledge. How are you meant to evidence and fund these services if you don't have the space available in the first place? Finally, it perpetuates the mistakes of the past if we don't address this. The mistakes of seeing mental illness as a separate alien experience from the rest of society, rather than something we all have and that society inevitably shapes and impacts. It also makes the mistake of treating easily accessible green spaces as a luxury for the rich and in excess, rather than a fundamental part of our society that we must all be able to incorporate into our lives for our health and well-being. Conference, we need to close the gap between mental health knowledge and mental health practice. I ask you to support this motion.
Many thanks, Emily. And next, speaking against this resolution is Sam Melnick of Southside Central Branch. So welcome, Sam.
Good afternoon, Conference. Now, I'm speaking against this resolution not because I believe nature is unimportant, nor because I want to minimise the impact of poor mental health on people. Rather, I'm speaking against this resolution because I believe these are both hugely important issues that I worry this resolution conflates in a way that minimises both. We know that in order to tackle the climate and ecological emergency, we need to increase the number of green spaces across Scotland. We know that we need more trees, more plants, more places in our cities that are green and full of nature. We also know that access to nature correlates with improved mental health outcomes. I'm not denying any of this. But we also know there remains stigma regarding mental health conditions that discourage many from seeking help. My concern over this resolution is that by the time people seek help, it may frequently be too late for nature to help. While I agree that nature is vital in maintaining good mental health, by the time someone's speaking to a GP, their mental health is unlikely to be good. If one's mental health is already poor, going outdoors and being active can seem impossible. Conference, I've been diagnosed with depression and I currently take antidepressants. Yesterday I had to pull out of speaking in favour of a resolution because I couldn't make myself function. On a bad day I can't get out of bed, shower or eat. On a bad day I certainly can't go for a walk in nature. I'd like to preface the next section of my speech with a content warning for discussion of suicidal thoughts, so feel free to turn away if that's something you don't want to hear talked about. When I first developed depression, I was a student at university. I went for regular walks, I even studied outdoors and I spent lots of time in nature. This didn't stop me from developing depression. I only sought help after I started having thoughts about ending my own life. If the doctor had referred me to a link worker telling me to go and spend more time in nature, it wouldn't have changed anything about my mental state. And things would have only been allowed to deteriorate at a time that would have been actively dangerous for me. Nature is not a cure-all and it cannot prevent all mental health issues. And what's more, I also believe that nature is vital for everybody, not just those with diagnosable mental health conditions, not just those who've spoken to a GP. I do believe nature should be accessible to everyone, mentally healthy and mentally ill, and it shouldn't take a prescription for someone to be able to access nature. We need to ensure there are ways to access nature before people reach crisis point, before GPs are getting involved. So Conference, precisely because I believe nature should be accessible to all, and precisely because we need better mental health care, I can't support this resolution. We need more nature and we need more mental health services, but I don't support the conflation of these two issues in a way that I feel diminishes both. So I'm sorry, but I can't vote for this resolution today.
Thank you very much, Sam. And Sam was our final speaker on Resolution 14. So let's move on to voting now, delegates. So for Resolution number 14, entitled Social Prescribing of Nature in Scotland, please cast your vote now.
Okay, so delegates at the SNP online conference are delegates are right now voting on the final resolution for this afternoon session, which is entitled Social Prescribing of Nature in Scotland. Now, this refers to the success, as the motion puts it, since 2017 of nature prescribing. And this was a collaboration originally set up between the NHS Shetland and the RSPB Scotland, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds in Scotland. And this scheme for nature providing has recently been nature prescribing has now been rolled out in Edinburgh recently. And what it does, with the support of the Royal College of General Practitioners, is encourage GPs to actually prescribe such things as joining a walking group, going for nature walking groups, becoming part of a community garden scheme, working perhaps alongside volunteers. And we've heard from speakers that some people who have been prescribed such nature remedies have themselves become volunteers. So on the one hand, the speakers for the group, Serena Cowdy and Maggie Bell and Emily Ratcliffe, have spoken to the Jules Bell and Serena Cowdy and Emily Ratcliffe. They've said that there are well documented now examples of success. I think it was Jules who said that people who have been prescribed natural and nature walking and nature involvement remedies have not only felt improvements in their mental health, but also have reported improvements in dealing with pain. So it's not just mental health, but physical health. So 3 speakers for the resolution have been very enthusiastic about giving GPs this alternative to traditional drugs therapies and to the idea of simply prescribing a nature remedy. Speaking against, however, Sam Melnick, who talks about the situation of people who are already suffering from depression, suggested that it might be too late. As somebody who is in a very serious situation and who may in fact even be contemplating suicide, for such people, stronger recipes and more professional, if you like, more serious and more urgent interventions may be necessary. So although Sam agreed that nature remedies have their role, when somebody's in a very serious position, they really need counselling and they need help of such a nature and such an urgency that by that stage, nature therapy is not going to be good enough. So Sam said, "I'm afraid I cannot bring myself to vote for this motion." Sam also pointed out, however, that we do have to recognise that green spaces are important, not just for people who might be using it as therapy, but green spaces are in fact a natural right. And we shouldn't regard green spaces and access to nature as a luxury only available to rich citizens. So that's what was being discussed today in the final resolution. So we'll move in just under a minute or so to hear how the delegates have voted on that. Now, I'll just take a few seconds to look forward to what we're going to do next. Shortly, we're going to have a discussion just for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll let you go this afternoon. So thanks for sticking with us as we cover this afternoon's debates. And just a few seconds, we'll go to hear the vote on resolution number 14. We'll also be back tomorrow afternoon after Maggie, who does the full Scottish at 12 o'clock. And I'll be back about 1 o'clock to look at the Sunday afternoon debates. So I'll give you an update on what motions are going to be discussed tomorrow after we hear back from Kirsten Oswald, and we'll hear shortly for the voting on resolution number 12 on social prescribing of nature. Okay, we'll hear the voting on that in just a few seconds.
Thank you very much, Conference. And resolution number 14, social prescribing of nature in Scotland, passes with 303 votes to 91. So delegates, that was our final resolution today, but there's still plenty to see and do at the Fringe and the exhibition and the Blether sections, which you will find on the left-hand side of your screen. They're all absolutely worth a look. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great Saturday night, and we'll see you all again at 10:30 tomorrow morning.
Okay, that's a quick look at what the SNP Conference will be discussing tomorrow. Now, what we're going to do now in Broadcasting Scotland is we'll just tie up this afternoon's debates with a short discussion, and I'm going to be, as soon as we can get her wired in, we're going to have a chat with Ruth Watson, who's, I think, trying to get a connection with us now. So while we're waiting for Ruth, let's just have a look at what's coming up tomorrow. So the SNP Conference continues on Sunday. There will be a speech from Ian Blackford, the SNP leader of the contingent in Westminster, and there will be further discussion on a number of propositions, a number of resolutions. Now, one I'm particularly looking forward to hearing from tomorrow is the discussion introduced by Tim Rideout again on the Scottish Reserve Bank. Now, Tim Rideout spoke today on one of the resolutions, and he's one of the people proposing that an early move by the first independent Scottish government should be to set up a Scottish Reserve Bank, and their job will be to set up a Scottish currency. So that's going to be discussed tomorrow, and so we're going to be looking at that one, and we'll see what the arguments for moving early towards a separate Scottish currency and therefore away from sterlingisation. So I think Ruth's with us now. Let me see. Can you hear me, Ruth?
Yes. Hi, how are you doing?
Okay. Oh, there you are. Good. Yeah, it's grand to see you. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. So you've been following the debates today in the afternoon session of the conference, I guess.
Yes, assiduously. I'm one of the delegates for the Kirriemuir and Dean branch, so I take my duties and
So
responsibilities.
you are actually one of the voters I've just been waiting for.
Yes, well, the thing is, I've never been a member of a political party before 2016. Being a journalist and being a thorough and professional journalist, I always maintained a very strict neutrality. But then I went from no to yes in 2014, and in 2016, 2015 was the first time I voted for the SNP. And I'd lived overseas for a number of years, so I wasn't sort of here while they were sort of proving their worth during the devolution years. And 2016, 3 days after the vote, I joined the SNP. But I have my membership on an annual basis, so I'm not. Every year I make an active choice as to whether or not I continue my membership. So. I think it's really important that people consider what kind of country they want to live in, and for those who can, perhaps take as active a role as they can in that. And for now, where I am at the moment, the SNP is it.
Yes, well, just before we move on to the conference itself, you've raised the issue there of people moving from no to yes, if you like, and the whole question of neutrality. I think at the moment we're in a position in Scotland where we're faced by the COVID crisis, we're faced by the climate crisis, we're faced by the Brexit crisis. So there are issues where people have to take a stand. You can't really be an innocent bystander because lots of stuff is happening, and Scotland is at the centre of it. I'm just going on about this just now because we at Broadcasting Scotland, we believe that we have to have an independent Scottish voice. We believe that opinions have to be available so that people can make an informed decision when the next independence referendum comes round. So we ourselves are doing our best to give a balanced and neutral position on the issues that are coming up.
It's not really a neutral position, is it? I mean, you give a. I think one of the reasons I support Broadcasting Scotland is because I think that there is such overwhelming bias against an alternate perspective in the mainstream media. I mean, my former colleagues, I watched some people who trained me in editorial standards, and I watched the editorial standards they now work to, and I know that is completely counter to the way that I was trained, and so I know that they know they should be doing better than they are professionally in some of the output that I see. So I don't think that Broadcasting Scotland is neutral, but I do think that you try to present a balance and an alternate and informed and sourced view to that which we see promulgated through the mainstream media.
I think if we have a position, well, from the way I look at it anyway, is that we maybe try to reassert the balance, because yes, I agree with you. The reason we exist is because we don't think Scotland is being properly served with neutral broadcasting media. So, well, we're neutral about the facts, Ruth. We're neutral about the truth, but we're maybe not neutral about whether issues should be debated in Scotland or whether they should be discussed in London. So we're not neutral in that sense, that we are pro-Scottish, but we want to try and give proper, and we want to try and give a proper context to what's going on, so that we hope that our listeners and our readers can, our viewers, can make their own decisions, and that we hope that what we do kind of gives a counterbalance to what the mainstream media is pointing out to them. So let's have a look at what was actually discussed today. Could you suggest, Ruth, what do you think was the most important of the resolutions discussed this afternoon?
Oh gosh, there were so many of them. I think that there were a lot. I've kind of got resolution blindness, and I don't have my document in front of me. But I think that things like, for example, equality of access. So from the sign language, so ensuring that there are trying to develop a wider understanding and use of sign language for those who use sign language as their first language. My daughter in Australia, when she was at primary school there, the primary school was twinned with the local deaf school. So while my son in the older classes was learning Japanese, she was being taught in the Australian Sign Language and was part of the signing choir. And I think that was just such a good way of doing it. So she's very comfortable. Um, she's very comfortable, being around people who are have a range of who have a range of abilities, who have a range of hearing abilities, and it doesn't faze her to be using a bit of sign language or to exchange pleasantries with people. And I think that that's a really good thing to be normalized. So I was very encouraged to see that coming forward and being very well explained and promoted and passed. Um, I actually think unanimously, if memory serves. There was another very good resolution to support those students who have got sort of familial or parental estrangement, so that for kids who, my husband and I were in a lucky enough position that we've been able to be the guarantor for our youngsters in university for their accommodation. But for those students who don't have accommodation, who don't have relationships with their parents, for those parents who don't have, they don't have any resources, it's very difficult to get a guarantor. So there have been a number of issues raised, which I think very much speak to social justice. There's a very interesting fringe event looking at Scotland's food and drink sector, a very interesting fringe event. A very interesting fringe event looking at the health service, which of course is extremely important, as John Swinney touched on in his afternoon speech, extremely important in terms of the damage potentially being done to us through the Internal Market Act, which may well force us, as the NHS is being privatised, may well force us into an alley we really don't want to go down. There's a Just Transition Bill, there's carbon capture, a really important issue which people in the Central Belt might not even think about, which is the transport infrastructure to Dumfries and Galloway. As somebody who's lived in islands and rural communities, I'm actually really astonished and fairly continuously shocked at how Dumfries and Galloway is kind of left out of the equation so often. So I think that there's a lot there. There's a lot happening, and much of it very ethical and very considered. Tim Rideout was very interested in very interesting what he was saying earlier, looking at our economy, and I just think we've got so much potential. There's so much there that we can do. There's so much there that the members want to do, and all of it we need independence to do it. So roll on next year, and the clarion call for Indie Ref after the referendum bill becomes an act, I hope.
Yeah, what a sigh of relief you'll hear in the country once that, as they say, once the starting gun's finally fired. Yes, as you say.
I think you'll find the sigh of relief will come after we win it. It's that's for me. I'll not be sighing any relief until I see that we've got a good, healthy majority for Scottish independence. I think that there will be perhaps a collective clamour for action once it's called, rather than a sigh of relief.
Well, yeah, lots of people have been saying in various media that maybe the arguing and the dissent you hear at the moment in and those who support Scottish independence, maybe they will come together once there's actually something to aim for, once there's actually a date. So I don't suppose we're going to hear anything this weekend about Nicola Sturgeon thinking about when but she will speak on Monday, though I don't suppose she's going to give us a date then. I expect she'll stick to what she said earlier on, that once COVID is no longer impacting seriously on our lives, then we can begin to look ahead. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's hear on Monday what she says.
The informed opinion that I am hearing is that it very much is going to be once the referendum bill passes through Scottish Parliament, and once it passes into law, then that is when I'm led to understand the First Minister is likely to then put a date, and that date most likely, there's a kind of two being sort of dangled. One is that it might be a very short campaign and just maybe next September that there would be a vote, or the other is sometime in 2023, which would still give us time to transition out of the UK within the life of this Holyrood Parliament. And I think that there's a lot of augurs out there, the fact that we're seeing the Flemish now is talking about, sort of developing infrastructure for ports for Scottish and independent Scotland, sort of dealing directly with the EU, which of course I hope we shall be back into immediately. And that also would give us a time, 2 years would also give us time to do that. And I think that when you look, I know a lot of engineers, and there's a lot of projects coming on board which have European funding and European connections. So it seems to me, just by looking at the augurs, as though the lifeboat is being built, and I'm very hopeful that come the spring we'll see the doors kicked open and we can set sail for good ship Indy.
Aye, that's interesting. So the word is then that the referendum bill will be published in the Scottish Parliament in the early new year, or maybe sometime in the spring, and then following on that, maybe a consolidation on when the date will be. Yes, I'm wondering about the UK timetable. The argument for going for 2022 is that there's probably not going to be a general election. Probably Johnson's not going to call a general election until 23. That seems to be the general thinking. So we'd probably like it to get it well out of the way before another UK general election. So that probably puts sometime late 22 in the pole position.
Yes, and I think that might also partly explain why there are so many rumours flying around about the 1922 committee and Johnson's longevity. I suspect that as Theresa May, the First Minister called, sort of announced that there was going to be an independence referendum back in 2017, and Theresa May went and had a snap general election, and actually we lost SNP MPs there, and part of the reason for that, I was going around the doors, tapping on doors and hearing people's viewpoints, and it was very interesting. In 2017 there was one woman I spoke to, and I keep meaning to go back and tap her door again one of these days just to sort of see where she is at now, and she told me she'd voted yes in 2014, she'd voted SNP in 2015, she'd voted Remain in 2016, but in 2017, for the first time in her life, she was voting Tory, because Brexit was happening and she wanted to strengthen the Tories' hands. And that was the most stark, but the most sort of obvious kind of wow, kind of like, moment. But there was a few people out there who were saying that they were so worried by Brexit, and they were really worried that Scotland would be blamed if Brexit went badly. So I think that we have a lot of advantages now, because Brexit is going appallingly. There's a reason why the SPS, the sanitary phytosanitary aspect of the paperwork of Brexit, has been kicked down the line, and now is due to come in January. Partly it's to do with the Good Friday Agreement, but partly also I suspect it's because the Tories are desperately trying to hold off the worst impacts, because Brexit's bad. We've got empty shelves all over our supermarkets at the moment, and our local, like our local agricultural stores. But we ain't seen nothing yet. The worst is still to come. So because of the paperwork, the extra paperwork due to come in. So I think the Tories have been desperately holding off. I think the British nationalists have been desperately holding off. So I think that there's a few elements at play. If there's a chessboard, it's maybe that kind of Star Wars 3-dimensional chessboard. There's a few different aspects at play. And I think this is why we keep seeing, oh, will Johnson be ousted or won't he, to sort of try and make it harder for the calculations as to when the best time for Scotland to go to the polls for an independence referendum is.
Yes, now looking at the politics of it, I alluded earlier on when we were talking about the carbon capture scheme being cancelled and the Tory party's support for the oil industry. And I was suggesting earlier on that this weekend might be a turning point, that the Tories have definitely they've staked their claim. They are the party of oil. And I think this week, I don't know if I'm putting it too strongly, but I think this is the weekend when the SNP historically ceased to be the party of oil. Is that right? Do you see that the SNP has now moved beyond oil?
I think that was made clear last week, and I think it's been made increasingly clear since COP, or sort of during COP. And interestingly, I think that there seems to be actually a reflection of the reality. I mean, again, I know a lot of engineers who work in the oil and gas sector, and even 2 years ago, the oil and gas industry magazines and papers were all talking about oil pipelines and the future of oil. Now, actually, a lot of their content is about renewables and how to get. There's a huge issue at the moment about hydrogen, because we're all being told that hydrogen's the answer, but there's so many different kinds of hydrogen, and actually, in order to get hydrogen to its end use point, there's no industry standard. There's no agreement as to what kind of hydrogen it should be. Most hydrogen will have to be mixed in with methane, and the pipelines that we have around the world, because they're made out of metal, would be corroded by hydrogen. So within the industry papers, the conversation is much less to do with gas and oil. Well, much less to do with oil, but gas still is likely to be there in the mix because of hydrogen and the means of transporting it. Now, you've just had 3 of the major oil companies in the world shut down pipeline operations and sort of shelve projects, and shut offices. So I think that perhaps what is happening with the Conservative Party is that they are clinging, as so often seems to be the case, to some sort of heady nostalgia of kind of like, Dame Vera Lynn's Spitfires and now the oil industry, whereas the SNP and the Greens are looking very much at the realities of the modern world.
Now, this, of course, raises a huge question. You remember the Labour Party in Scotland? It used to run the place. Maybe you were out of the country at that time, but maybe you came back and you thought, where's the Labour Party gone? But they must be in a huge dilemma, right? Because every time they make a speech saying SNP selling out oil workers' jobs, aren't they putting themselves in exactly the same camp as the Conservatives? Aren't they making the same mistake that they made in 2014? Put the union first, or put the old oil industry first, and now it's Labour and the Conservatives against SNP and the Greens.
Well, actually, I suspect you've missed it because you've probably been on air, but just before I came on, I spotted that Anna Sauer, who seems to have had kind of like, I think that he's had the poison kiss from Richard Leonard, or whatever the poison chalice is that's passed around the Labour Party. They've just announced a Green Labour, which seems to be stepping away from oil and gas. So perhaps they've decided that the label, the moniker of being red Tories perhaps wasn't sitting well, so they're now trying to be Green Labour. But I'm not sure. I mean, it actually is one of those great tragedies, I think, of modern politics, that the Labour Party, which used to stand for something, it used to be meaningful. I mean, I very much believe in unions on a number of levels. and was a member of the National Union of Journalists for many years. In fact, sort of sat on several of their committees for several years, and but I always felt very uncomfortable having to pay a levy directly to the Labour Party, because I never wanted I wasn't never quite. I mean, I would vote Labour when it was expedient, um, but I was never quite sure. I felt very uncomfortable going to a conference and sort of being required to refer to each other as comrades and brother and sister, and I'm kind of like, that kind of gave me the boke a bit. I mean, sorry to Chris McCusker, but that's not the terminology. I didn't feel, for me, that was an authentic thing to be doing, or it seemed quite contrived. Especially in the years of Blair, because I remember actually I didn't vote for Blair. I'd actually had an operation. I'd had surgery that day, so I couldn't vote. It's the only time in my life in this country that I haven't voted. But I sat up for Portillo. I kind of sat up and I listened to the things can only get better, and I remember my husband and I looking at each other with sweet, naive hope in our hearts that this might actually be a tipping point. And I think that was one of the things that started to sort of sow the seeds for me moving towards the Scottish National Party. The days of Jim Sillars, you just, I'm not going there, mate. You know what I mean? But I think that the Labour Party, for so many people, I'm one of them, the Labour Party left me before I left Labour. And actually, I think that what the SNP did was very clever. They kind of went from this sort of traditional kind of tartan Tory concept that many had to being the party of social justice and being the party of inclusivity. It actually wasn't until I'm mixed race and I come from a very diverse family, and it wasn't until I heard Nicola talking about Scotland as having the kind of population and the kind of ownership of Scotland as you would if you were Australian or American. Kind of like, if you come here, there's more ways to become a Scot than just by being born here and having kind of Celtic roots. And for me, that was a big turning point. I thought, actually, this is somebody I can trust, because she's telling me that Scotland will welcome all the colours of the rainbow, and I think that's really important. And I think that the SNP in recent years, while not getting everything right by any means, I think has done a huge amount. I speak to a lot of new Scots who are in no doubt that they are welcome.
Yeah, I quite often have conversations on social media with people in England, some of whom I used to work with. I spent a lot of years in England. And, well, generally, the people I know think that England seems to have gone in a very kind of Trumpian Republican direction. People I know, for example, campaign for the NHS in England. And it seems to me there's a widening gap between politics in England and politics in Scotland. Now, I don't mean by people. The people in England are not really all that different to people in Scotland, in my experience, having lived half of my life in each country. But the politics in England, the politics is pulling that whole political system in one direction, and the Scottish political system is going in another direction, it seems to me. Now, I think one example of that is the debate on refugees, which, of course, we've reported on this week on Broadcasting Scotland. The whole tone of the debate on refugees from the Tories, who, after all, are the dominant party in England, is to see refugees as a menace, to see them as an enemy. And you talked earlier on about the Battle of Britain kind of language and all that. And we see all that being trotted out again. We'll fight them on the beaches. That's basically what Johnson's letter to Macron said last week. He basically says, we'll fight them on the beaches of Calais. But Scotland seems to have a different position on that. As I said, I don't think it's because we are better people than English people are, but one thing's for certain, we need refugees. We need young people to come here. I've read a lot of people this week saying the sort of person who will spend thousands and take their family thousands of miles through all sorts of dangers to try and give them a better life. That's the sort of person we need here. We need young, energetic people like that. So again, I think Scotland is going in one direction, but maybe behind that, we actually need more population, don't we? The Scottish population is not replacing itself, so we're on another side of refugee debates. So is that one of the areas in which Scotland is different, is more progressive?
Yeah, I mean, I have a number of issues with the kind of phrasing that there is behind that question, although I do understand that you don't mean it to sound crass, but it is a kind of phrasing that we've heard in a number of sort of different ways from a number of different outlets. Um, Refugees are people. I prefer to talk about people who seek refuge, people who need to have a valid reason to come. I think 70% of those people who are put their lives in the hands of people traffickers to get here. Um, I think I think it was Alfie Dubs was saying yesterday, or somebody in the House of Lords was saying yesterday, that there's one person who has applied for asylum through the conventional, through the appropriate channels, has been given asylum, and that the number of people able to claim asylum and come through the sort of the route that has been left open by the UK government is one person, which is horrific. And 70% of those people who put their lives in the hands of human traffickers and risk everything to get in a dinghy or get in a van to come to this country, 70% of those asylum claims are successful. And France takes many, many, many more asylum seekers than the UK does. I do agree that the kind of people who end up coming generally are people, I suppose, like many of those of us taking part or watching this program. You know, they're well educated. Many of them actually come from fairly higher sort of socioeconomic backgrounds because they're well educated and their parents have got the means to get them on a boat or on a means of getting them over here. Many of the women and girls who are coming over will have experienced horror that we can't even begin to imagine in the course of their passage here. And it's one of the reasons why we often see so many young men, is because the young men are the ones who are sent over in the hope that they will be safer getting here, they will be less vulnerable, and when they get here, they perhaps will be able to create a route for the other people who have valid claims within their family to come to this country to seek asylum. And it's certainly not the case that you have to claim asylum in the first safe country that you come to. That's just not the case at all. But it's really heartbreaking. You know, I saw the photograph of that 21-year-old woman who was killed on her way over. Her wedding photograph, or her engagement photograph, her betrothal photograph. You know, she's a fiance of a student. She's a Kurd. She was a Kurd. She was a fiance. She had a life, and now she's dead. And the Kurds are horrifically discriminated against in Iraq. And her fiance was studying over here. She's 21 years old. She thought that she had a chance, and now she's dead. And I think that we need to reflect upon what we would do. You know, I actually have a brother. I've a half brother who, when the Algerian Civil War was raging, when he was just before the age that he would have been forcibly conscripted into the army to fight against the terrorists, he managed to escape to Spain, and he spent many weeks and months sleeping on the beach in Spain as a 17 or 18-year-old young man before actually managing to get work with a circus, and then training through that, and now he has citizenship, or he has the right of residency in France. He has a family there, and he has a really senior job, and but you know, when I listen to my family talking about my family over there talking about finding a decapitated human head in their courtyard, and my youngest half brother spending the night on the roof with the other young men with guns that they'd managed to appropriate, keeping guard because the terrorists were beating a drum and walking around the neighborhood, and prepared to do appalling things to anybody that they could get their hands on. I have every sympathy. I've got friends from Palestine. I've got friends from, having lived in Malaysia, which is a Muslim country. The Islamic university there had many professionals coming from Iraq and from Palestine. And my daughter, at the age of 4, she 5, she was in a class with somebody, and they were doing a project for Christmas, and we were planning, getting ready to go away and get on planes and go and see family. So they were doing a little project about transport, and one of the questions was, what do airports mean to you? And we went to look at the display that these children had put on, and my little girl had drawn a picture of like a Christmas tree and presents and sort of happy people. And this other little girl, who I was very good friends with her parents, she had, my little girl had said, Christmas is about Granny and hugs. And this little girl she said airports, that was what it was, airports are about meeting my family and having hugs. And this other little girl had written, airports save your life. And she had drawn a photograph of her family running down the street with planes bombing their house. And that is why I could never condemn anybody for getting in a boat to go across the channel and risk their lives, because if that was my child, what would I do to save them?
Yes, Ruth, thank you. Thank you for that. Language is important. Language is important. I use the word refugee because we have signed international law. It's our responsibility to provide refuge, and refuge means a place of safety, and it's our job to provide a place of safety to those who need it. Ruth Watson, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. You have another busy day tomorrow. I see there's a lot of motions to discuss, and you will be coming to that point that Tim Rideout is going to raise on the Scottish Reserve Bank. So if you would like to join me again, 1 o'clock tomorrow, after the full Scottish, Maggie will be here at 12 to have a look back on the week's news, and then we're going to look at the rest of the Sunday afternoon SNP deliberations on the online conference. Okay, so thanks for joining Broadcasting Scotland. And thank you to Ruth Watson for joining me this afternoon. It was great talking to you. Take care.
Thank you for having me.